I've never really told anyone this in full detail, not even my wife. Honestly, I don't know if I should. But something inside me keeps saying that if I don't let this story out, it'll eat me alive. So here it is, the night I realized some cemeteries aren't just about the dead staying buried. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and the cemetery is older than the library. Ours was called Ashwood Cemetery, named after the massive ash trees that twisted over the graves like they were keeping watch. As a teenager, I didn't think much of it. Kids dared each other to walk through there at night, whispering about ghost sightings and shadows moving on their own. But me? I wasn't into dares. I worked part-time mowing the grass and raking leaves there. It wasn't creepy during the day. Peaceful, even. Families visiting, the breeze rattling through the ash trees, the smell of damp earth. But at night, that place changed. I know, because I once had to stay there. It was late October, maybe a week before Halloween. Mr. Coleman, the groundskeeper, asked if I could help him with something unusual. Someone had been breaking into the cemetery at night, knocking over headstones and stealing small things, trinkets, flowers, even a brass plaque from one of the older graves. "It ain't kids," Mr. Coleman said, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "No kid messes with certain graves." I asked what he meant, but he just waved me off and muttered about tradition. That night, he offered me $100 to stay in the caretaker's shack and keep an eye out. "Just call him if I saw anything," he said. Easy money. So I brought my flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and sat in that drafty little shack with nothing but the sound of wind in the ash trees. At first, it was boring. I read, I dozed a little, and around 1 a.m., I decided to take a walk. That's when I noticed something odd. One of the oldest sections of the cemetery, the part with crumbling stones from the 1800s, had a faint glow. Like candlelight. At first, I thought some kids were having one of those midnight seances. I crept closer, trying to be quiet. But when I peeked around a monument, I didn't see kids. I saw one man. He was kneeling in front of a grave so weathered I couldn't even read the name. Around him were 5 candles, all flickering though there was no wind. He had his head bowed and was whispering something I couldn't hear. Now, I know I should have called Mr. Coleman right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer. That's when the man stopped whispering. And turned his head. His face was pale, too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes locked on mine, and I swear to God, they reflected the candlelight even though I wasn't close enough for that to make sense. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was calm, but something about it made my skin crawl. I managed to stammer, "This place is closed. You need to leave." He didn't move. Instead, he looked back at the grave and placed something on the stone. A small bundle wrapped in cloth. Before I could even ask what it was, the ground beneath that grave shifted. I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but no, it was moving. The earth was rising, cracking, as if something beneath was pushing upward. The man whispered again, this time louder, in some language I didn't recognize. My stomach turned cold. I stepped back, tripping over a root. That's when the earth split open. It wasn't a full body, not like in movies. What came out first looked like a hand. Gray, skeletal, with fingernails that looked more like claws. It gripped the edge of the grave and pulled. I was frozen, unable to scream, unable to breathe. The pale man didn't flinch. He just kept chanting. Another hand appeared, then the top of a skull, yellowed and cracked, pushing through the dirt. I finally found my voice and shouted, "Stop." That's when the man turned to me again, his expression twisted with something between anger and pity. "They don't belong beneath the ash," he whispered. And then the thing in the grave turned its head toward me. Its jaw opened wide, wider than any humans could, and I swear I heard my name and the rasping sound that came out. I bolted. I didn't stop to see what else climbed out of that grave. I ran all the way back to the caretaker's shack and locked the door, shaking so hard I spilled my coffee everywhere. I must have passed out, because the next thing I remember, it was morning. Sunlight was streaming through the cracks, and Mr. Coleman was shaking me awake. I tried to tell him what I saw, but he just went pale and muttered, "Damn it." I told them not to try again. I begged him to explain, but he refused. Some graves ain't meant to be opened. You keep quiet, boy. Forget what you saw. But I couldn't forget. For weeks after, I had nightmares of that thing clawing out of the earth, calling my name. I thought maybe it was just my imagination until one night, I drove past the cemetery on my way home from work. In that same section, I saw more candlelight. More shadows moving. And I realized, whatever that man had started, it wasn't over. I quit working there soon after. Moved to another town, tried to bury the memory. But last month, something happened that pulled it all back. My wife and I bought an old house. Nothing special, just a fixer-upper. While cleaning the attic, I found a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a cracked piece of bone and a scrap of paper with one word. Ashwood. I don't know how it got there. And now, every night, I hear scratching beneath our floorboards. I've lived in many towns across the Midwest, but there's one I never go back to. It's not because of the people, or the weather, or even the bad memories of my childhood. No, it's because of a gate, an iron, rust-eaten cemetery gate that still shows up in my dreams. And every time I dream of it, I wake up with dirt under my fingernails. Back when I was 19, I worked as a night shift security guard. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for gas and rent. Most of my assignments were boring, watching empty lots, construction sites, warehouses. But one fall, my boss gave me a week-long post at St. Hollows Cemetery. "Easy money," he said. "Just sit in the booth, keep an eye out for vandals, and call the cops if needed." I didn't mind. Cemeteries never scared me. My grandma used to say, "It ain't the dead you should be afraid of, it's the living." For the first 2 nights, she was right. The cemetery was silent, the streets around it deserted. I drank coffee, read books, and listened to late-night radio. But on the 3rd night, something strange happened. At exactly midnight, the gate rattled. I looked up from my thermos, thinking maybe the wind had caught it, but the air was dead still. I stepped out of the booth, flashlight in hand, and shone it across the iron bars. The gate wasn't just rattling, it was vibrating, like something was pounding against it from the inside. The padlock was clinking against the metal as if straining to hold. Probably just the metal contracting in the cold, I told myself. But my gut said otherwise. When I leaned closer, I noticed something I hadn't before. Etched into the arch of the gate were words so weathered they were barely readable. "They return only if invited." I frowned, chalking it up to some old engraver's idea of poetry. But then, as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. The cemetery was silent again. I went back into the booth, but sleep didn't come easy. The next night, it happened again, midnight on the dot. This time, the rattling was louder, like dozens of fists slamming the iron at once. My heart pounded as I stood frozen in the booth, staring at the shaking bars. Then, through the gaps, I saw them. Hands. Pale, bony hands gripping the bars from the inside. Too many to count. Some large, some child-sized, all clutching the rusted iron as if begging to be let out. I dropped my flashlight. By the time I scrambled to pick it up and shined it back, the hands were gone. The gate stood perfectly still. I thought about quitting, but money was tight, and pride kept me there. One more night, I told myself. That decision still haunts me. On the 5th night, I brought my friend Derek with me. He was one of those loudmouth skeptics who loved proving people wrong. When I told him about the gate, he laughed until he cried. "You're just tired, man. Too much caffeine. I'll sit with you and show you it's nothing." So we waited. At midnight, the gate began to rattle. I braced myself, but Derek just grinned. Nice wind effect. Real spooky. He grabbed his phone and started recording, walking right up to the bars. "Come on out, then," he shouted. "If you're real, show yourself." The rattling stopped instantly. Silence. Derek turned back to me, smirking. But then, the lock clicked. We both froze. The padlock, a heavy steel one, began to twist on its own. The shank popped open with a metallic snap and fell into the dirt. Slowly, the gate creaked outward. "Holy shit," Derek whispered. His smirk was gone. The air around us dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Our breath fogged in front of our faces. From the darkness beyond the gate, figures began to appear. Not walking. Not floating. Just forming, like smoke hardening into shape. One by one, they took on the outlines of people. Men in ragged coats. Women with hollow faces. Children clutching faded toys. Their eyes glowed faintly, a pale white light that wasn't natural. They stepped forward in unison, silent but purposeful. Derek screamed. We bolted for the booth, slamming the door shut and crouching beneath the desk. My hands shook as I dialed 911, but the phone cut off before I could even hear a ring. Outside, I heard footsteps. Dozens of them. The crunch of dirt and leaves under countless feet. They circled the booth, dragging their fingers against the walls, scratching, tapping. Then a voice whispered through the glass. Not loud, not angry. Just calm, almost pleading. "Invite us." I pressed my hands to my ears, rocking back and forth, refusing to listen. Derek, though, wasn't as strong. His breathing was ragged, panicked. "They're just voices," he muttered. "It's a trick. Just say it. Just to see." Before I could stop him, he shouted, "You're invited." The tapping stopped. The air went dead still. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then, every window of the booth exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down on us as the booth filled with icy air. Hands grabbed Derek first, yanking him out through the broken window with impossible strength. He screamed as he was pulled into the darkness. I scrambled out through the back door, sprinting across the lot. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I looked back, the booth was gone. Not destroyed, gone, as if it had never been there. So was Derek. The police never found him. They searched for weeks, dredging ponds, questioning locals, even suspecting me for a while. But no trace was ever found. I quit the security job and moved away. I never told them the truth, because who would believe it? But the worst part isn't the memories. It's what's happening now. You see, every year on the same date, at exactly midnight, no matter where I am, I hear that same rattling. Sometimes in my closet, sometimes at my front door, sometimes in my dreams. And last night, I woke up to find dirt under my fingernails again. Only this time, there was something else, an old, rusted padlock on my nightstand. The same one from St. Hollow's Gate. And it's open. People always ask me why I don't like funerals. I usually give them some half-baked excuse about not wanting to remember people in coffins or being uncomfortable around mourning families. But that's not the truth. The real reason is that funerals remind me of what I once did, the thing I promised myself I would never talk about again. But lately, it's been gnawing at me, pressing against my ribs like a buried secret clawing to get out. So here it is. This is about the time I worked as a gravedigger in Hollow Pines Cemetery and broke a promise I never should have broken. I was 22 at the time, broke and aimless. My uncle, who managed Hollow Pines, offered me the job. "It ain't glamorous," he said, "but it pays steady. Just dig the plots, keep the grounds clean, and lock up at night." The cemetery wasn't small, it stretched across acres of rolling land, with crumbling statues and crooked headstones. A wrought iron fence encircled it, though much of the fence was rusted and broken. The oldest section, way in the back, hadn't been used for decades. My uncle called it the Shadow Row, a stretch of graves from the early 1800s, their names mostly worn away, the stones leaning like drunks. He warned me about that section on my first day. "Don't go digging there," he said. And if you hear voices in that part at night, don't answer. No matter what they say. I laughed it off at first. But his eyes told me he wasn't joking. For the first few weeks, the job was simple. Hard labor, yes, but simple. I dug, I hauled dirt, I set flowers where families asked me to, and I locked up the gates at sundown. At night, I'd sit in the small caretaker's shed, reading or smoking, sometimes listening to the owls in the trees. But eventually, the nights grew different. It started with whispers. One evening in October, I was closing the gates when I heard what sounded like children giggling from the direction of Shadow Row. The sound was faint, carried by the wind. I froze, because no one should have been there. When I turned my flashlight toward the old graves, I saw nothing but crooked stones and shadows. But the giggling stopped, replaced by a woman's voice, clear as day. "Come closer, please." I dropped the flashlight. My uncle's warning echoed in my head, "Don't answer." So I didn't. I grabbed my things, locked up fast, and went home. But the voices didn't stop. Every night after that, around midnight, the whispers came. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes soft weeping, sometimes my own name spoken in a voice that sounded eerily like my mother's. I tried ignoring it, but it got harder each night. Sleep became impossible. My dreams were full of faces I didn't recognize, rotting, eyeless, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I started drinking just to knock myself out. Finally, one night, I broke. The voice was calling louder than ever, almost desperate. "Help us. Just one shovel. Free us." Against every instinct, I picked up my spade and walked to Shadow Row. The moon was bright that night, painting the cemetery in silver and black. As I approached, the air grew heavy, as though the earth itself didn't want me there. My boots sank deeper into the soil, damp and soft. I stopped at a grave that looked fresher than the others, though it had no marker. The ground was slightly raised, as if something underneath had shifted recently. And from beneath that mound came the voice. "Please, just dig." My hands trembled as I sank the spade into the earth. Each thrust felt wrong, like I was cutting into flesh. The soil was oddly warm, steaming in the cold air. The deeper I dug, the stronger the smell became, a foul stench of rot and dampness that clawed at my throat. And then, with one final shove, the blade of the spade struck something solid. I brushed the dirt aside with my bare hands and uncovered wood. A coffin. Old, waterlogged, its surface splintered and dark. The voice whispered again, softer now, "Open it." I don't know what made me do it. Curiosity? Madness? Maybe the voice itself was inside my head, urging me on. I wedged the spade into the seam and pried it open. The coffin lid creaked, splitting in half. Inside was no body, at least, not as I expected. What lay inside was a figure made of shadows, its form shifting and pulsing like smoke. Two glowing eyes stared up at me, and a smile, thin and sharp, spread across its face. "Thank you," it whispered. Before I could react, the shadow surged upward, through my chest, into me. I gasped as ice filled my lungs, my vision swimming. For a moment, I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. I was somewhere else, standing in a vast black field, surrounded by countless figures whispering, reaching, clawing toward me. When I snapped back, the coffin was empty. The voice was gone. But something was inside me now. For the next few days, I felt wrong. My reflection didn't match me. When I looked in the mirror, sometimes my eyes seemed too dark, my smile too wide. I couldn't keep food down. At night, I'd wake up outside, standing barefoot in the cemetery dirt with no memory of walking there. Then the dreams started. In them, the shadows spoke to me, "You freed me. Now I'll free you." I begged my uncle for help. He listened quietly, then shook his head, grief in his eyes. "You broke the rule," he said. "You answered them. You dug." He handed me a small silver key. "Take this to the caretaker's vault beneath the chapel. Lock yourself in if it comes again. Don't open the door, no matter what you hear." I never made it to the vault. The final night came fast. I was closing the gates when the air shifted, thick, electric, like a storm was about to break. The voice rose again, but it wasn't pleading anymore. It was laughing. My shadow, stretched long by the moonlight, began to move on its own. It twisted, lengthened, rising up from the ground like a second figure attached to my feet. I froze, horrified, as it turned its head toward me. The same glowing eyes stared back. The same sharp smile. "You're mine now," it whispered. I ran, sprinting toward the chapel. But the ground beneath me softened, turning to mud. Every step dragged me deeper. By the time I reached the chapel stairs, I was knee-deep in soil that felt like hands pulling me down. My shadow surged forward, wrapping around me, forcing its way into my mouth, my ears, my eyes. I screamed until dirt filled my throat. Then everything went black. When I woke, it was morning. I was lying in my bed at home, clothes clean, no dirt on me. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I looked in the mirror, my reflection smiled before I did. And it hasn't stopped since. I've carried this memory with me for nearly 30 years, and even now, it refuses to fade. I can still hear it when the nights get quiet enough, the low, echoing toll of bells that no one alive should ever hear. Some people say trauma warps memory, that the brain fills in details to make sense of what it can't understand. Maybe that's true. But I swear on my life, every word I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I remember it. It began in the fall of 1995, in a place called Black Hollow Cemetery. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I was a college sophomore, restless and desperate to prove myself braver than I was. A couple of friends had dared me to sneak into the cemetery after dark, stay for a full hour, and bring back something interesting as proof. A stupid idea, but at 19, pride outweighs reason. Black Hollow wasn't your average graveyard. It had been abandoned for decades, surrounded by thick woods, its gates chained shut with rusted links. The town whispered about it the way people whisper about haunted houses, half disbelief, half fear. The legend was that Black Hollow had once been home to a small chapel with a bell tower. During a funeral in the late 1800s, lightning struck the tower, sending the bell crashing down through the roof, killing everyone inside. Since then, they said, no one had dared rebuild it. I didn't believe the stories. But when I crawled under the gate that night, I felt the weight of the air change instantly. It was colder inside, the kind of cold that clings to your bones. My flashlight barely cut through the fog curling low to the ground. The cemetery stretched wider than I expected. Headstones leaned like crooked teeth, many broken, some sunk so deep into the soil that only the tops remained. The trees pressed in close, their branches arching overhead like claws. The silence was heavy, no crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. Just silence. I walked deeper, forcing myself to breathe steadily, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. After 20 minutes, I hadn't found anything worth taking. Just dirt, moss, and stone. My friends would laugh me out of the dorms if I came back empty-handed. Then I saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, half hidden by trees, stood the remains of the old chapel. Its walls sagged inward, the roof long gone, but a jagged stump of the bell tower still jutted upward like a broken finger. Against all reason, I felt pulled toward it, as if something in me already knew that whatever proof I needed would be found inside. The chapel smelled of mold and burnt wood. My flashlight beam skimmed across broken pews, shattered glass, and piles of rubble. In the center of the floor lay a massive iron bell, cracked clean down the middle, its edges blackened. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch it, when the ground beneath me gave a sudden shudder. The bell shifted, scraping loudly across the stone floor, though I hadn't laid a hand on it. I froze, heart hammering. Then I heard it. A single, hollow toll, deep and resonant, echoing through the chapel. I staggered back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The bell hadn't moved again, yet the sound rolled on, vibrating in my chest like thunder. It was impossible. The bell was cracked, broken, yet I was hearing it ring. And it wasn't just one toll. It kept going. 2. 3. 4. Each strike slower, heavier, shaking the air around me. By the 5th toll, the ground began to stir. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the way shadows play tricks on your eyes when you're scared. But no, the earth beneath the pews was rising. Dirt split, stone shifted. One by one, skeletal hands broke through the floor, clawing their way upward. I stumbled backward, tripping over debris, as shapes dragged themselves free. Some were nothing but bones. Others still wore tatters of clothing that fluttered as if in a wind that wasn't there. Their skulls turned toward me, hollow sockets glowing faintly, reflecting the flicker of my flashlight. The bell tolled again, and they all moved in unison, their jaws opening and closing in a soundless chant. I bolted for the doorway, lungs burning, but something in the air pushed back against me, thick as water. My legs felt like they were dragging through mud. Behind me, the bell tolled one last time, the sound so loud it nearly split my skull. And then came the voices. They weren't whispers, not at first. They were loud, rising together in a guttural chorus. Some cried, some screamed, some begged, all tangled into a wall of sound that clawed at my sanity. Words twisted through the noise: stay, join, remember. I clawed my way out of the chapel, gasping as the air lightened, but the voices didn't stop. They followed me, echoing through the cemetery, pressing against my skull like fingers prying my thoughts apart. That's when I made my mistake. In my panic, I turned back. The figures had followed, dozens of them spilling out of the chapel, dragging themselves across the ground. And in the center of them all, floating above the cracked bell, was a shape darker than the night around it, a figure cloaked in shadows, faceless, yet staring straight at me. It raised an arm, and the voices stopped instantly. Then, in a voice that rattled the trees, it spoke one word. Promise. I don't know why I answered. Maybe it was fear, maybe the pull of something I didn't understand. But before I could think, I whispered back, I promise. The figure lowered its arm. The dead froze, their jaws snapping shut. Then, as if sucked back into the earth, they collapsed, bones shattering into dust, rags disintegrating into nothing. The silence returned. I didn't wait. I sprinted out of that cemetery, climbed under the gate, and didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the streetlights. When my friends asked what I found, I lied. I told them I'd chickened out, that there was nothing there. They laughed, called me a coward, but I didn't care. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next night, just as I was falling asleep, I heard it again, the toll of the bell. Slow, steady, impossible. My dorm room shook with the sound, though no one else seemed to notice. It happened again the following night. And the next. Always at midnight, always 5 tolls. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, curling at the edges of my hearing. They grew louder each night until they were impossible to ignore. Promise, keep your promise. I tried drowning them out with music, alcohol, anything, but nothing worked. Eventually, I started answering. Just small things, yes, or I hear you. It only made them stronger. By the end of the semester, I couldn't take it anymore. I dropped out and left town, thinking distance would help. It didn't. The bells followed me, no matter where I went. It's been nearly 3 decades now. I've moved states, changed names, tried therapy, medication, religion, nothing works. The bells toll every single night, without fail. And the whispers always come after. The worst part is what happens during funerals. Whenever I attend one, family, friend, even strangers, I hear the bell louder than ever, and I see the faint outlines of the dead rising behind the coffin, waiting, watching me. I don't go to funerals anymore. But tonight feels different. The tolling was louder than it's ever been, shaking the windows of my house, making the walls crack. And for the first time, the voice didn't just say promise. It said, time to collect. And as I write this, I can hear footsteps in my hallway. I used to work nights at a gas station on the outskirts of a small town called Graymarsh, and it was the kind of dead-end job where nothing ever happened. You'd stare at the clock, wipe the same counter 3 times, and wonder why your life had turned out so dull. But sometimes dull is better, because one night, during a shift I thought would be as uneventful as the rest, a man came in and changed my life forever. He wasn't like the usual customers, the drunks, the late-night truckers, the occasional cop grabbing coffee. This man was different. He wore a long black coat that looked too heavy for the mild autumn air, and in his hand, he carried something I almost mistook for a lantern, though it didn't glow like normal light. Instead, it pulsed faintly, like the dying heartbeat of a star. His face was pale, lined with deep creases, and his eyes were the strangest part. They looked like glass marbles, cloudy yet shining, as if something inside them was trapped and desperate to get out. He set the lantern on the counter between us and said in a low, deliberate voice, "You work close to the cemetery, don't you?" I nodded, confused. Graymarsh Cemetery was only a mile down the road, hidden behind a row of oaks. "Yeah, why?" He leaned closer, and I caught the smell of damp earth clinging to him. "You've seen the light there?" I shook my head. He smiled faintly, though it wasn't the kind of smile meant to comfort. "You will," he said. "When you do, don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't let it follow you." Before I could ask what he meant, he picked up the lantern and walked out into the night, leaving the faint sound of rattling chains behind him. I thought about that man for weeks, wondering if he was just some eccentric drifter. But then, on a foggy night in November, I saw it for myself, the light in the cemetery. It was close to 3 a.m., and I'd stepped outside for a smoke. The highway was silent, the fog thick enough that headlights would have looked like ghosts. Through the mist, over the tops of the oaks, I saw a pale glow flickering where Graymarsh Cemetery stood. It wasn't steady like a street lamp or warm like a candle. It moved, swaying side to side, drifting slowly among the graves. My first thought was that it was vandals, maybe kids with flashlights. But then I remembered the man's words, "You've seen the light there, don't follow it." I tried to ignore it, but night after night, the light kept appearing. Always around 3 a.m., always drifting through the cemetery in slow, deliberate arcs. And each time, I felt a pull in my chest, as if some invisible thread were tugging me closer. Finally, one night, curiosity, or maybe something stronger, won. I locked up early and walked down the road toward the cemetery. The gate to Graymarsh was half collapsed, iron rusted to brittle flakes. I stepped over it easily, the fog curling around my legs like smoke. Inside, the air felt different, colder, thicker, heavy with the weight of silence. The glow was deeper among the graves now, weaving like a lantern carried by unseen hands. I followed. The light led me past rows of leaning headstones, past mausoleums with doors rusted shut, past statues whose faces had been worn smooth by rain. My footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the earth itself were listening. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the glow drew me forward until I reached the heart of the cemetery, the oldest section, where the graves were little more than crumbling stones half swallowed by the ground. There, at the base of a massive oak tree, the light stopped. It hovered for a moment, brighter now, and then lowered itself to the ground. And that's when I saw him. The Lantern Man. He was kneeling beside an unmarked grave, the same strange lantern glowing in his hands. He didn't look at me, but I felt certain he knew I was there. His voice drifted through the fog, calm and steady, "You shouldn't have followed." My heart pounded, but I managed to whisper, What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the lantern down on the grave. Its glow spilled across the earth, and the soil began to move. At first it was subtle, like the shifting of worms beneath the surface. But then the ground cracked, splitting open, and a hand, pale, skeletal, impossibly thin, pushed upward into the night air. I stumbled back, but the Lantern Man didn't move. He just whispered, "Every light needs fuel. Every soul needs a keeper." The skeletal hand clawed higher, followed by the remains of an arm, or rib cage, a face with hollow sockets staring directly at me. The corpse dragged itself free, its jaw hanging loosely, its teeth clicking together like chattering bones. The lantern man picked up the lantern, and the corpse froze, its empty sockets glowing faintly with the same pulsing light. I wanted to run. God, I wanted to. But my legs refused. My body felt nailed to the ground, trembling violently, my breath caught in my throat. The lantern man finally turned his head toward me. His cloudy eyes caught the glow, and I realized the truth. Inside each of his eyes, faintly visible, were faces. Dozens of them, mouths open in silent screams, trapped behind the glassy veil. You followed, he said, his voice like gravel dragged across stone. Now you carry the flame. Before I could react, he raised the lantern and pressed it against my chest. The pain was immediate and blinding. It wasn't fire, it was colder than ice, a searing emptiness that burned through my ribs, my lungs, my heart. I collapsed, clutching at the ground, gasping for air I couldn't draw. When I looked up, the lantern man was gone. So was the corpse. Only the faint glow remained, flickering beneath my skin. I could see it through my hands, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I staggered out of the cemetery and somehow made it back to the gas station. I told myself it was a nightmare, some hallucination from lack of sleep. But the glow never left. Even now, years later, when I turn off the lights, I can see it faintly in the mirror, pulsing beneath my skin, a lantern trapped inside me. At first, I thought it was harmless. Just a strange mark, a curse maybe, but nothing worse. But then the voices started. They came at night, whispering from the corners of my room. Sometimes they were begging, sometimes screaming, sometimes promising things I didn't want to hear. Set us free, they'd say. Feed the light. And then the deaths began. A month later, a man was found dead on the highway near the cemetery, his body pale and shriveled, as if something had drained him from the inside out. The same thing happened to a woman walking her dog, then a pair of teenagers sneaking around the woods. Each time, I felt the glow inside me pulse stronger, brighter, and the voices grew louder. I knew then what the lantern man had meant. Every light needs fuel. Every soul needs a keeper. I didn't want this. I never asked for it. But the lantern inside me is hungry, and it doesn't care what I want. I've tried starving it, ignoring it, but when I do, the pain becomes unbearable, like my insides are being clawed apart. The only relief comes when it feeds. And the worst part? I don't even have to be there anymore. The light leaves me at night, slipping out of my skin, drifting through the dark like a phantom lantern. By morning, it returns, stronger than before. I've stopped watching the news. I can't bear to see the faces of the ones it's taken. But I feel them, just like the lantern man's eyes. When I look in the mirror now, I see them inside me, dozens of faces pressed against the glow, their mouths moving in silent pleas. I don't go near cemeteries anymore, but it doesn't matter. They come to me. Every night, I see the glow outside my window, swaying gently, waiting. And last night, for the first time, I heard the lantern man's voice again. Not enough. You must keep the flame alive. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The glow is stronger every day, and my reflection doesn't wait for me to move anymore. It watches me, smiling faintly, just like his. If you ever find yourself in Greymarsh, and you see a light drifting through the fog, don't follow it. Because it's me. And I can't stop anymore. I've lived most of my life in a quiet rural town in upstate New York, the kind of place where people die and get buried in the same county they were born. Nothing much changes here except the seasons, and maybe that's why our old cemetery feels like such a constant. Pine Hollow Cemetery sits just beyond the tree line on the north edge of town, hemmed in by a sagging stone wall that looks like it might collapse with one good shove. It's been there since the 1800s, and if you walk far enough back, you can still see the weather-worn graves of settlers who built the town with their bare hands. I never thought much about the cemetery beyond the occasional funeral until the night I first heard the bell. It started as a faint sound in the wind, like a far-off church service drifting on the breeze. I'd been walking my dog near the cemetery around midnight, the air brittle with the first touch of winter, when the ringing carried over the wall. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of bell you'd hear tolling for a funeral procession. My first thought was vandalism, maybe kids messing around with one of the iron fixtures in the graveyard. But the sound wasn't random. It came in measured intervals, steady as a heartbeat. My dog froze, his ears pricked forward, a low growl humming in his throat. The hair on the back of my neck rose, and before I knew it, I was backing away from the wall, tugging the leash until we were nearly running down the road. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Wind against metal, some leftover sound from town, maybe even my imagination. But when I drove past the cemetery on my way to work, I noticed something odd. A small group of fresh graves stood near the back section, and each one had a short iron pole beside it with a thin cord running into the ground. At the top of each pole hung a small handbell. I'd heard of safety coffins before, old contraptions from the 19th century when people were terrified of being buried alive. They'd attach a bell to a cord in the coffin, so if the dead woke up, they could ring it and alert someone above ground. I assumed the graves were part of some quirky restoration project, maybe to honor old traditions. It was strange, sure, but nothing more than a historical oddity. Or so I thought. That night, I heard the bell again. This time, I wasn't walking the dog, I was lying in bed, the window cracked open. The sound drifted across the town like a whisper, soft but steady. One toll, then silence. Another toll, then silence. My chest tightened as I sat up in the dark, straining to be sure. There was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was ringing that bell in the cemetery. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound came back, like a metronome in my skull. By dawn, I had convinced myself that someone had been buried alive. I couldn't shake the thought all day. My work at the hardware store was a blur, my mind locked on the graves with the bells. By evening, exhaustion made me reckless. I decided I had to check. So just after midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and drove to Pine Hollow. The fog was thick that night, draped across the ground like a living thing. My beam of light cut through it in narrow slices, illuminating crooked headstones and sagging mausoleums. The deeper I walked, the quieter the world became, until the only sound was the crunch of my boots against frost-crusted leaves. And then I heard it again, ding, ding, ding. The sound led me to the new graves. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I saw the cords twitching. The bells weren't moving wildly, just a faint, rhythmic tremor, as if the hand below was weak but determined. I dropped to my knees beside one of the graves, clawing at the dirt with my bare hands. I didn't care how insane it seemed, if someone was alive down there, I had to get them out. But before I could dig more than a few inches, the sound stopped. The cords went still. My breath plumed in the cold air, harsh and ragged. I leaned closer, ear nearly to the soil. Nothing. Just silence. Then, faintly, a whisper seeped through the earth. Too late. I bolted. My flashlight swung wildly as I sprinted through the fog, the words still echoing in my skull. Too late. Too late. Too late. When I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion had warped the sound, I forced myself to sleep. But sleep didn't help. Over the next week, the bells kept ringing, always just after midnight, always in that slow, deliberate rhythm. Some nights, the tolling came from one grave. Other nights, 2 or 3 rang in unison, their cords trembling in the dark. I told the police, of course. They came, poked around with their flashlights, and left shaking their heads. Probably vandals, they said. But I knew better. Vandals don't bury themselves alive just to ring a bell. The worst night came a week later. The bells didn't stop. Usually, they would ring for a few minutes, maybe half an hour, then go quiet. But that night, they went on for hours. I could hear them even with my windows closed, even with pillows over my head. Ding, 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 steady and endless, until I thought I'd go mad. Finally, near dawn, I snapped. I drove to the cemetery in my pajamas, flashlight clutched like a weapon. The fog was thicker than ever, a choking curtain that swallowed the world. The bells led me to the graves again, their cords jerking now with a frantic rhythm. My flashlight beam landed on the nearest cord, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't attached to the pole anymore. It was stretched taut, leading out of the grave and snaking across the ground. I followed the line with trembling hands until the beam of my light revealed something that made me stagger back in horror. The cord ended in a hand. It was pale, skeletal, the flesh hanging in tatters, the fingers curled around the rope as if clinging for dear life. The corpse had clawed its way halfway out of the ground, its jaw unhinged in a silent scream, and in its hand, it still held the cord that once ran into its coffin. The bell hung uselessly above it, clattering against the pole. Before I could run, the other graves stirred. Dirt shifted. Hands broke the surface. One by one, the dead dragged themselves free, cords clenched in their fists, bells rattling wildly in the fog. And then, from the darkness, came the sound of a larger bell. Not a handbell, but a great iron toll, deep and resonant, shaking the ground beneath my feet. My flashlight flickered, sputtered, and died. In the darkness, I heard the voice again. Too late. I don't remember how I got home. The next thing I knew, I was in bed, dirt caked under my nails, the smell of earth in my hair. I tried to tell myself it had been a dream, but when I went to the cemetery later that day, the graves were undisturbed. No broken ground. No cords out of place. No sign of the dead clawing free. But the bells are still ringing. Every night. And last night, I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. The bells don't just come from Pine Hollow anymore. I heard one ring outside my window. When I looked out, I saw cords stretched taut across my lawn, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. And I swear I heard it whisper again. Too late. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and as kids, we didn't have malls or movie theaters to hang out at. Our version of fun was sneaking into places we weren't supposed to go, abandoned houses, old barns, the quarry, and most of all, the cemetery that sat at the edge of town. Maplewood Cemetery was enormous compared to our population, with sections dating back to the Civil War. Most of it was overgrown, the gravestones tilted at odd angles, names half worn away. Parents warned us to stay out after dark, claiming the ground was unstable and dangerous. But kids don't listen. We wanted to scare ourselves, and the cemetery was perfect for that. When I was about 16, me and two friends, Caleb and Marcus, made a tradition of sneaking into Maplewood every Halloween. We'd bring flashlights, maybe a bottle of cheap whiskey, and dare each other to spend as long as possible in the oldest section of the graveyard. It was harmless fun until the year everything changed. That night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes every sound carry farther. The moon was swollen and bright, and the trees stood like black skeletons against the sky. We pushed through the rusted gates just after midnight, laughing too loud, trying to hide the fact that we were all a little scared. The deeper we went, the quieter the world became. It felt like the cemetery itself was swallowing our noise. We made it to the oldest section and picked a cracked stone to sit on. Caleb pulled out the whiskey, Marcus lit a cigarette, and we started daring each other to walk further and further into the darkness. But before long, the laughter died down. Because we weren't alone. At first, I thought I imagined it, the sound of breathing. Not ours, not from the trees, but heavy, labored breaths, like someone with lungs full of water. We froze, flashlights sweeping the gravestones, but nothing moved. The sound stopped, and we laughed nervously, convincing ourselves it was just the wind. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like a shovel dragging lightly through dirt. We shone our lights around again, but the sound wasn't coming from above ground. It was coming from beneath our feet. Caleb muttered something about safety coffins and the bells they used to use, and suddenly the joke wasn't funny anymore. Marcus, who always pretended to be the brave one, crouched low and pressed his ear to the ground. After a long moment, he jerked back, pale as chalk. Something's moving down there. We didn't want to believe him, but when the earth beneath one of the nearby graves shifted, we all saw it, the soil heaving like something was pushing up from below. Caleb screamed, and the three of us bolted, stumbling over headstones in our rush to escape. But before we reached the gates, a voice called out. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. Don't leave me here. We stopped dead, our breaths steaming in the cold air. Marcus swore, Caleb dropped the whiskey bottle, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. The voice hadn't come from behind us, it had come from below. Against all reason, I turned back. My flashlight beam quivered over the graves, landing on the mound of earth that had shifted before. The soil cracked, and a pale, dirt-caked hand broke through, fingers curling desperately toward the sky. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Marcus hissed at me to stop staring, but I couldn't. The hand clawed higher, followed by a wrist, then part of an arm. And beneath it, the voice again, raspy and broken, "Don't leave me." That was enough to snap me out of it. I grabbed Caleb and Marcus and hauled them toward the gate. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the road, our lungs on fire, sweat freezing against our skin. None of us ever went back to Maplewood, at least not for years. But the memory festered, the image of that clawing hand etched into my mind like a scar. By the time I was in my 20s, Marcus had moved away, Caleb was working construction, and I was stuck in town, bouncing between dead-end jobs. Life moved on, but that night in the cemetery never left me. I'd dream about it sometimes, the sound of breathing, the scratching, the hand breaking through the dirt. I told myself it was just a body settling in the grave, some natural phenomenon, but I never fully believed it. Then, one summer evening, Caleb called me out of the blue. His voice was shaky, nothing like the loud, cocky friend I remembered. "You hear it too, right?" he asked. I didn't know what he meant. "The voice," he whispered. "I hear it every night. It comes from the ground. Always the same words, 'Don't leave me here.'" My blood went cold. I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that maybe stress was getting to him, but deep down, I knew. It was the same voice we'd heard that night. Somehow, it had followed him. 2 weeks later, Caleb was found dead. They said it was an accident on the job site, a fall from scaffolding. But I knew better. At his funeral, ironically, held in Maplewood Cemetery, I couldn't stop staring at his coffin as they lowered it into the ground. I half expected to hear the bell, the scratching, the voice. Nothing came, but the silence felt heavier than anything else. That night, lying in bed, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. Scratching. Not outside, not in the cemetery, but under my floor. I pressed my ear to the hardwood, hard hammering, and heard it clearly, the dragging of nails through dirt. Then the whisper, muffled but distinct. "Don't leave me." I barely slept after that. The sound came back every night, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud it rattled the floorboards. I moved apartments, then towns, then states, but it didn't matter. The sound always returned. I tried everything, therapy, sleeping pills, even recording devices. But no matter where I was, no matter what I tried, I'd hear that same voice from below, "Don't leave me." A year later, Marcus reached out. I hadn't spoken to him since we were teenagers, but his email was frantic, barely coherent. He said he couldn't escape the scratching, the breathing, the voice. He was planning to dig, to find the source, to finally free whatever was beneath Maplewood. The email ended with a single line, "Meet me there tomorrow night. Bring a shovel." I should have ignored it. God knows I wanted to. But curiosity, or maybe guilt, drove me back to Maplewood Cemetery for the first time in nearly a decade. The place looked even more decrepit than I remembered. The gates sagged, vines choked the stones, and the air carried that heavy, suffocating stillness. Marcus was already there, pale and thin, a shovel clutched in his hands. His eyes were sunken, ringed with sleepless shadows. "You hear it too," he muttered, "no greeting, no preamble. We have to let it out. We should have done it years ago." Before I could protest, he was already digging into the mound where we'd seen the hand years before. The soil turned easily, almost too easily, like it wanted to be disturbed. The deeper he dug, the stronger the smell grew, a wet, rotting stench that clawed its way into my lungs. And then, the shovel hit wood. Marcus dropped to his knees and tore at the soil with his hands until the lid of an old coffin was visible. It was cracked, the wood blackened with rot. From inside, the scratching grew louder, frantic, desperate. My stomach churned as Marcus wedged the shovel under the lid and pried it open. What we saw inside wasn't a corpse. Not exactly. The body was half preserved, its flesh leathery, its eyes sunken but aware. It raised its head slowly, staring at us with a hunger that felt older than death itself. Its mouth moved, forming those same words we'd heard for years, "Don't leave me." Marcus screamed and stumbled back, but I couldn't move. I was frozen as the thing sat up, dirt cascading from its form. It reached out, not weakly now, but with terrifying strength, its fingers curling around the edge of the coffin. Then it smiled. "Now you're here with me." The last thing I remember is the ground giving way beneath us, the graves collapsing inward like the earth itself was swallowing us whole. Darkness closed in, and I swear I felt hands, dozens of them, grabbing, pulling, dragging us down. When I woke, I was outside the cemetery gates, alone. Marcus was gone. No one has seen him since. But every night, without fail, I hear the scratching under my floorboards. Louder now. Closer. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can feel the earth shifting beneath my bed, ready to give way. And I know, one day soon, I'll be pulled under too. When I was in college, I took a part-time job as a night caretaker at an old cemetery called Greenvale. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent, and I figured it would be an easy way to study in peace while earning some money. My duties were simple: walk the grounds a few times a night, make sure no vandals or drunks wandered in, lock the gates before sunrise, and log everything in a journal the owners kept in the small office near the entrance. The first few nights were uneventful. The cemetery was massive, spread across rolling hills with gnarled trees that seemed to loom over every path. At night, the air was thick and still, and every sound carried too far. A branch snapping could sound like a body moving. A distant owl could echo like a scream. I told myself it was just atmosphere, that cemeteries weren't inherently scary, it was people's imaginations that made them so. But I quickly realized Greenvale wasn't like other cemeteries. On my fourth night, I found something that unsettled me. It was the logbook. Each caretaker had written their entries over the years, usually noting things like all clear, locked gates, trash picked up. But as I flipped through older entries, I noticed strange phrases scattered between the routine notes. Things like "the ground moved again" or "voices near the West Hill, no one there," or "the caretaker keeps calling, but he's been dead 20 years. At first, I thought it was some kind of inside joke. But then I saw the last entry from the previous caretaker. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, it simply said, "Don't follow him if he asks for help." That same night, as I made my rounds near the West Hill, I saw him. A man standing among the graves, motionless, his back turned toward me. He wore what looked like an old caretaker's uniform, dark coat, cap, heavy boots. My first thought was that it was one of the groundskeepers who hadn't retired yet, someone the owners forgot to mention. "Hey!" I called, my voice louder than I intended in the quiet. The man turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He looked at me with an expression that was hard to describe, not angry, not welcoming, but heavy, like he'd been waiting too long. "Help me," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying unnaturally across the night air. I froze. The warning in the logbook screamed in my mind, "Don't follow him if he asks for help." The man extended one hand, beckoning. "Please," he said again. I ran. Back in the office, I locked the door and sat trembling, staring at the logbook as if it might explain what I'd just seen. My shift ended at dawn, and when the sun finally rose, the figure was gone. I considered quitting right then, but something in me wanted answers. The following night, I brought a thermos of coffee and forced myself back onto the paths. Hours passed with no sign of him, and I started to wonder if exhaustion had made me hallucinate. But around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice came from the far side of the cemetery this time. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut across rows of gravestones until it landed on him, the caretaker, standing by an old mausoleum. He looked even paler now, his uniform tattered, one sleeve hanging loose over an arm that didn't seem entirely solid. "Help me," he repeated, staring directly into the light. I forced myself to speak. "Help you with what?" He didn't answer right away. Then he raised one finger and pointed at the door of the mausoleum. "Inside," he whispered. The mausoleum belonged to the Aldrich family, one of the wealthiest names in town history. Their crest was carved above the iron door, which was rusted shut. My flashlight beam slid over the stone and caught faint scratch marks near the handle, like someone had clawed to get out. "Open it," the caretaker said. I shook my head. "No. I'm not doing that." His expression didn't change. He just kept pointing, his arm stiff, his voice growing colder. "Open it." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, so I backed away. His form flickered, like a candle flame in the wind, and then he was gone. The mausoleum stood silent, the door unmoving, the scratches glaring back at me in the beam of my light. I didn't go near it again that night. But when I returned to the office, the logbook was open on the desk, though I hadn't left it that way. A fresh line had been written in unfamiliar handwriting: "You can't leave him inside forever." Over the next week, things escalated. Every night, the caretaker appeared, always in a different place, always pointing toward the Aldrich mausoleum. Sometimes he said nothing, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Other times, he repeated the same words over and over until they filled my skull: "Help me. Help me. Help me." I started avoiding that section of the cemetery, but it didn't matter. The scratching followed me. Beneath the ground, against mausoleum doors, even faintly against the windows of the office. By the 8th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the logbook and flipped back through decades of entries, looking for anything that mentioned the mausoleum. Buried among the notes, I found a passage from the 1970s, "Aldrich boy buried alive by mistake." The bell rang for hours. We couldn't open the door in time. His cries still echo. My blood ran cold. That night, the caretaker appeared closer than ever, standing just outside the office window. His face was inches from the glass, eyes wide, lips barely moving. "Open it," he mouthed. I don't know what possessed me, but I grabbed the ring of cemetery keys and walked to the mausoleum. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped them. The lock groaned but gave way, and the iron door creaked open, the sound like a scream in the still night. Inside, the air was suffocatingly stale. My flashlight beam cut across rows of stone coffins, dust thick on their lids. At the center was a smaller casket, wood splintered, the lid clawed from the inside. And then I heard it. Not the caretaker's voice, not the whisper from the grave, but a child's voice. Thin, ragged, impossibly faint. "Don't leave me." The sound rooted me to the spot. My beam shook over the ruined casket, where tiny scratch marks lined the inside lid. My chest tightened as the voice came again, louder this time, filled with rage. "Don't leave me." The air seemed to collapse inward, crushing me. The caretaker appeared in the doorway, his pale face twisted into something unreadable. "You opened it," he said, his voice like stone grinding against stone. "Now you've let him out." Behind me, the casket lid shifted. A small, withered hand reached out, the fingers snapping unnaturally quick as they clawed for air. I stumbled back, slamming into the caretaker, but he didn't move. His eyes burned into me as the child's form dragged itself free. It wasn't a child anymore. Its body was twisted, its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes black pits that swallowed the light. "Don't leave me," it shrieked, lunging forward. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and stories about the local cemetery were told more often than ghost stories around a campfire. To most, it was just a patch of land with crumbling tombstones and a leaning wrought iron fence, but to me, it always had a pull. I never admitted it out loud, but as a teenager, I would ride my bike there at night just to walk through the rows. There was something calming about the silence, the way the moonlight fell across the names etched into stone, how it made me feel like I was surrounded by lives that had already been lived. By the time I was 23, I had long stopped visiting. Life got busy, and the childish fascination with ghosts had faded into the background. That is, until my aunt passed away and was buried in that same cemetery. I attended the funeral, and standing there beside her fresh grave, something inside me stirred, an odd familiarity, as though the ground itself remembered me. When the crowd dispersed, I lingered. That was when I heard it for the first time. A whisper. It was faint, almost like a sigh, drifting between the headstones. I thought maybe it was the wind, but the air was still. The whisper seemed to bend around me, brushing against my ear in a language I couldn't quite grasp, like syllables caught halfway between sound and thought. My skin prickled, but instead of running, I leaned closer to the graves around me, trying to hear more clearly. Stay. That was the word. Clear as day, pressed into my skull like someone had spoken directly into my mind. I stumbled back, scanning the cemetery, but no one was there. The others had gone home. The priest's car was gone. It was just me and rows of stone. I didn't tell anyone about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next night, I found myself back at the cemetery. I told myself it was to visit my aunt, but the truth was, I wanted to hear it again. The gates were chained, but I knew how to slip through a gap in the fence from my teenage adventures. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight, and as I walked through the rows, I felt a strange anticipation, like the air was waiting. Sure enough, the whispers came again. This time, more voices, overlapping, weaving in and out of each other like strands of thread. Some were too faint to understand, but others carried words that chilled me. Don't forget. Listen. Join us. The closer I stood to certain graves, the louder the voices became, as if each stone contained its own trapped echo. I pressed my ear to one, an old, cracked headstone with the name worn away, and I swear I heard sobbing. Soft, pitiful sobbing, like a child crying in the dark. I recoiled, my heart hammering, and nearly tripped over another grave behind me. That's when I realized something strange. The headstones weren't arranged the way I remembered. Paths seemed to shift, graves I'd known since childhood were suddenly in new places, and no matter how I turned, I couldn't find the fence. The whispers grew frantic. Stay. Stay with us. Don't leave again. Panic clawed at my throat. I ran, weaving through the stones, desperate for the exit. But the cemetery stretched longer than it should have, the rows multiplying, leading me in circles. That's when I saw the figures. They were faint, like shadows drawn from mist, standing beside the graves. Some hunched, some tall, some with features blurred beyond recognition. But all of them were watching me. Their mouths didn't move, yet their whispers filled the air. We remember you. You came before. You belong here. I shut my eyes and ran blindly until my chest ached, and when I opened them, I finally found the fence. I scrambled through the gap and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. That night, I told myself I'd imagined it, that grief and lack of sleep had gotten the better of me. But the truth is, part of me knew better. Over the next week, the cemetery invaded my dreams. I would wake drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my head, their words clear and demanding now, come back. Stay. Join us. My aunt's face appeared in those dreams too, pale and drawn, her lips moving but no sound coming out. And every time I woke, the same thing awaited me, mud on the soles of my shoes, damp soil under my fingernails, and once, a crumbled piece of moss that could have only come from a gravestone. The final straw came one evening when I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with television. The sound cut to static, and beneath it, I heard the whispers. Not from the screen. From inside the house. They were coming from the walls. I snapped. I grabbed my coat and keys, and without even thinking, I drove straight back to the cemetery. By the time I arrived, night had fallen, and the gates loomed like black jaws. I didn't slip through the fence this time. I pushed the gates open, though I don't remember how. They were always locked. The whispers guided me. I wandered deeper than I ever had, past the old sections and into a part of the cemetery I didn't recognize. The stones here were taller, grander, though most were cracked and tilted with age. In the center stood one monument unlike the others, an obelisk, towering, black stone polished as if it had never aged. My aunt's name was carved into it, though she had only been buried a week ago. And below her name, my name was already etched. The ground beneath me shifted. I looked down to see dirt crumbling away, revealing a hollow space. Before I could step back, I felt cold hands gripping my ankles, dozens of them, clawing from the soil. The figures rose around me, no longer mist but solid, their faces pale and sunken. "You stayed before," they whispered. "You came when you were young. We marked you then. You are ours." I screamed, thrashing, but the ground opened wider, and I was dragged down into the hollow. For a split second before the darkness swallowed me, I saw my aunt's face among the dead, smiling faintly as if to welcome me. I woke up in my bed. Morning light streamed through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I sat up, I saw dirt scattered across the sheets, clinging to my clothes, and scratches carved into my ankles where those hands had gripped me. And worse, I heard them. Not faint this time, not distant. Clear, steady, patient. The whispers. They're in my house now. In every corner, every shadow, murmuring the same words over and over. Stay. 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 I don't know how much longer I can resist. I never believed in ghosts until I started working as a night groundskeeper at Hollow Creek Cemetery. It was a small town in Vermont, the kind of place where people moved slowly and lived in the shadows of old forests and abandoned barns. I got the job through a friend, mostly for extra cash during college, and I thought it would be boring. My tasks were simple: check the gates, sweep leaves, trim overgrown grass, and make sure the older section of the cemetery wasn't being vandalized. The first few nights were quiet. Too quiet. The cemetery was massive, stretching across rolling hills and dense groves of oaks. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the headstones that leaned like tired old men. Each night, I walked the same paths, noting the same cracked mausoleums, the same tilted graves. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of a deer in the distance, or an owl calling, and I'd feel that eerie calm that only comes when humans are absent. But it was the fourth night that everything changed. I was near the oldest section, a part of Hollow Creek most townspeople avoided. The headstones here were blackened with age, names almost unreadable. As I passed a particularly large tomb, I felt a chill brush across my neck, the kind that makes you shiver even in mild weather. I stopped, shining my flashlight across the ground. Nothing. The wind had died down. The only sound was my own breathing. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the frost-crusted earth. I froze. My own boots made hardly a sound, yet this noise seemed amplified, echoing across the graves. I turned my beam toward the path, and there he was, a man in a long coat, standing perfectly still beside a moss-covered tomb. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, but the shadow of his features made him look hollowed, almost skeletal. "Good evening," he said, voice low and calm. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Hi." The man didn't move. Just watched me. Then he spoke again. "It's been a long time since someone noticed me." I wanted to run. My instinct screamed at me to bolt, to get back to the lights and the safety of the office, but something about his tone held me rooted. Curious, cautious, and maybe foolish, I asked, Who are you?" He lifted one pale hand, pointing toward the cemetery gate. I'm the one who keeps them safe, he said. The dead. They can wander if no one watches. I laughed nervously. The dead, wander? He tilted his head, as if my question amused him. Oh yes. But only those who have been disturbed. Only those who are restless. And then he did something I'll never forget. He reached into the folds of his coat and pulled out a small, black notebook. The leather was cracked and worn, and he opened it to a page filled with names. Dates. Small notes beside each. You'll see soon, he whispered. Before I could respond, a cold wind swept through the trees, snuffing out my flashlight. Darkness enveloped me completely. And then I heard it, the rustling, the soft creaking of boots on grass, too many to count. Shadows shifted around the tombs, low figures moving in patterns I couldn't make sense of. They didn't have faces, at least not the kind humans have. Just dark, smudged shapes, their forms fluid and constantly changing, yet their presence undeniable. I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my throat. The notebook slipped from his hands and landed at my feet. I bent to pick it up, and the names inside, they were familiar. Every name was someone buried in Hollow Creek. People who had died recently. People who had disappeared. People I'd known as a kid, friends and neighbors whose graves I'd passed 1,000 times. Suddenly, the shadows lunged. Not at me, but toward the man. He stood perfectly still, arms folded, expression calm. The dark figures bowed to him, forming a circle around the oldest section of graves. The air thickened, the fog rolling in like it had a life of its own. I could feel my heart pounding, blood roaring in my ears. And then he spoke. They obey me because I remember them. Because I care for them. But one day, I will not be here. What do you mean? I croaked. He turned toward me, and now I saw his face clearly. Hollowed eyes, pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, lips almost translucent. One day, he said, the next caretaker will be like you. They will hear the whispers, they will see the shadows, and they will know too much. The ground beneath me trembled. The shadows shifted closer. I stumbled back, tripping over roots and stones, my hand brushing the black notebook. The wind died suddenly, leaving a thick silence, broken only by a whisper. Stay, or join us. I ran. Through the fog, through the twisted paths of the cemetery, my lungs burning, boots slipping on the frosted ground. I didn't stop until I reached the gate, my hands shaking so violently I could barely push it open. I didn't look back, though I felt their eyes on me, the dark figures watching, waiting. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery with the manager. Everything was normal. No shadows. No cold wind. The notebook was gone. The man was gone. I tried to explain what happened, but no one believed me. Just my word against the silence of Hollow Creek. I quit that day. I left town a week later. But the nightmares didn't end. Every night, I see the cemetery. Every night, I hear the footsteps behind me. And sometimes, in the stillness of my apartment, I hear a calm voice whispering my name, reminding me that the caretaker is waiting. It wasn't until years later that I understood the full horror. I had kept my curiosity alive, researching the history of Hollow Creek Cemetery. The caretaker wasn't a man. He was a record keeper, someone, or something, charged with keeping the dead in order. And every few decades, he chooses a successor. When I drive past Hollow Creek now, I see figures moving between the headstones at night, silent shapes that vanish when the light touches them. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear a notebook snapping open in the wind, names being written as if I were next. I've moved cities, changed jobs, tried to live a normal life. But I can't escape it. The shadows, the whispers, the unseen eyes, they are patient. And I know, one night, I will hear the footsteps behind me again. And the caretaker will call. It's your turn. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and the cemetery behind the old church was where kids like me went to dare each other, to whisper secrets, and sometimes, to escape parents who didn't understand. The place was massive for our little town, rolling hills, crooked headstones, and mausoleums that looked older than the town itself. As a kid, I never thought much of it beyond the thrill of being there at night. But that all changed the night I heard the choir. I was 17, walking home from a friend's house on a cold October evening. The wind had picked up, rattling leaves across the cracked pavement, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple. As I passed the cemetery, I thought I heard singing, soft, harmonized, like a distant choir practicing in a hall. It was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. I stopped, trying to locate the source. At first, I thought it was coming from the church itself. But the windows were dark, no lights inside, and the doors were chained shut. That's when I realized the sound was coming from the cemetery. I stepped closer, drawn despite myself. The singing grew clearer, melodic but impossibly sorrowful, echoing across the graveyard in a way that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The notes weren't just music, they were words, voices layering over each other in perfect, unnatural harmony. Some seemed like children, others older, some I couldn't even place. The words were faint, almost like whispers in another language, yet I could understand them in my bones. Join, follow, remember. I froze near a crumbling headstone. My flashlight barely caught through the fog rolling along the ground, and the singing shifted. It wasn't a distant sound anymore, it was right next to me. I turned slowly, heart hammering, and saw them, dozens of figures, all pale, shadowed, standing among the graves. Some had features, some didn't, but all were singing. Their eyes locked on me. I tried to step back, but my boots sank slightly into the frost-hardened earth, as though the cemetery itself was pulling me toward the choir. My flashlight flickered and died. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and I realized I could no longer make out the edges of the graves. Everything blended together, the stones, the earth, the figures. It was a sea of shadows and harmonies, and I was in the center. A voice rose above the others, commanding and chilling. You hear us. You see us. You belong. I shook my head. No. I don't belong here. But the chorus continued, relentless. Their harmonies turned jagged, a discordant tension pressing into my chest, stealing my breath. I tried to run, but the ground shifted. Graves seemed to rise beneath me, as if I were walking on the backs of the dead. My legs gave way, and I fell to my knees. A hand landed on my shoulder. Cold. Ice cold. I spun, but no one was there. The hand remained on my shoulder, pressing me down. That's when I saw it, a figure separate from the choir. A man, or at least human in shape. He wore a black coat that hung past his knees, and a wide-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow. He raised a hand, and the choir stopped singing instantly, the silence pressing like a physical weight. The figure leaned closer, whispering a single word that cut through the fog. Listen. My ears strained to hear him, my mind scrambling to focus. Then he spoke again, slow, deliberate. They were once alive, like you. They lived, they laughed, they made mistakes. But the choir needs voices. And now, you are hearing them. You cannot leave until they choose you. My chest tightened, panic climbing like ivy. I don't understand. I want to go home. He smiled, or at least I think he did, the shadow of it brushing across his features. They don't let anyone leave. The choir began again, but this time I could see the movements of their mouths, their lips shaping words I couldn't fully hear, yet their meaning was clear: stay, join, sing. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly, stumbling over stones, brushing against the corpses of flowers and wreaths left by grieving families. The shadows followed, slipping between the headstones, merging with the fog. The sound of harmonized voices pressed into my skull, turning every step into a struggle. I darted toward what I hoped was the fence, hoping, praying, and for the first time, I understood the stories the old townsfolk had whispered about the cemetery. The graves weren't just markers. They were stages. Platforms. The dead weren't resting, they were performing, drawing in the living to fill their ranks. I reached the edge of the cemetery and saw the fence. Relief surged, until I noticed the shadows. They weren't chasing me, exactly. They were leaning, stretching, melting toward the fence, blocking my escape. I was trapped. And then I realized something worse. The shadows were not merely the dead, they were me. Reflections, echoes of my own body, my own face stretched into thin, pallid shapes, singing in harmony with the choir. The man in the black coat appeared beside me. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Once they mark you, you hear the song. Once you hear the song, you cannot escape." I screamed, clawing at the fence, but it was solid, unmoving, as if the air itself had thickened to trap me. The choir grew louder, chanting, rising like a tidal wave. I felt my knees buckle. My voice wanted to join the harmony, though I fought with every ounce of will. Join, follow, remember. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. I can't be certain. The sky above me blurred, night stretching infinitely in all directions. The choir closed in, the shadows pressing me toward the center of the cemetery. And then, a sudden silence. The man in black leaned close and whispered, so close I could feel his cold breath on my cheek. "You see? It's not about fear. It's about participation. The living provide what the dead cannot sustain on their own. And now, you are chosen." The choir began again, softer this time, more intimate. The harmonies curled around me, coaxing, gentle, persuasive. I realized I was trembling, not from fear, but anticipation. My lips parted. I tried to resist. I failed. And in that moment, I understood why the stories said the cemetery was haunted. It wasn't ghosts wandering aimlessly. It was music, a chorus that demanded continuity. Lives, once lived, repurposed to sustain the melody of the dead. I screamed once more, then found my voice melding with the choir, my own tone weaving into the harmony, irreversibly. I don't remember leaving that night. I don't remember going home. But I wake now every night with the sound of the choir in my ears. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in reality. And when the fog rolls over my town, I swear I can see pale figures in the windows, mouths moving in perfect synchrony, whispering, "Join, follow, remember." I've tried telling people, but no one believes me. They think I'm joking, or dreaming, or exaggerating. But I know the truth. The cemetery doesn't just hold the dead. It recruits the living. And one night, it will call for you. The choir waits. Always waits. And when it calls, you will sing. When I was a teenager, I stumbled across something that changed my life, or maybe ended it. I grew up in a quiet town in Maine, surrounded by dense woods and old, forgotten cemeteries. There was one cemetery in particular, Willow Creek, that no one visited anymore. The gates were rusted, the headstones cracked and leaning like weary soldiers. Most people in town avoided it, claiming it was cursed, but curiosity, as always, got the better of me. It started one summer afternoon when I was exploring the forest behind my house. I found a leather-bound book partially buried under a fallen oak, its pages yellowed and brittle. Inside was a hand-drawn map, detailing the layout of Willow Creek Cemetery, but it was unlike any map I had ever seen. Every row of graves was marked, some with names, others with symbols I didn't recognize. At the bottom, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a single line, "Follow the paths. They will guide you." I should have left it there. I didn't. That evening, I returned to the cemetery with the map tucked into my backpack. The sun was setting, painting the tombstones in shades of orange and gray, and a chill had settled in the air despite the summer heat. I walked the paths indicated on the map, following each winding trail with meticulous care. At first, everything seemed ordinary, moss-covered stones, the faint scent of earth, the distant croak of frogs. But soon, I began to notice small anomalies. Certain graves had flowers I hadn't seen before, fresh and wet with dew. Others had footprints in the dirt leading toward the older, neglected sections. And the deeper I went, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Sometimes I would glance between the stones and catch a glimpse of movement, something just at the edge of my vision. A shadow slipping behind a tree. A figure crouched in the distance. Each time I turned to look, nothing was there. I followed the map until I reached a section of the cemetery I had never seen, even though I had lived in the town all my life. The ground was uneven, broken, and strewn with old, unmarked graves. The air felt heavier here, damp and cloying, as though the earth itself was pressing down on me. I set the map on a large flat stone to study it more closely. That's when I noticed that the paths weren't just leading me, they were changing. The map seemed to shift beneath my fingers, new symbols appearing, graves rearranging themselves. A soft whisper brushed past my ear, almost inaudible, "You're close. Don't stop now." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but the only movement was the wind stirring the leaves. My heartbeat raced. My stomach churned. And yet, I couldn't stop following the map. Something inside me, fear, curiosity, maybe something darker, pushed me forward. As I moved deeper, I realized the graves were arranged in patterns that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Some had small stone figurines placed on them, birds, tiny animals, human forms. Others had scratches on the headstones, faint letters etched into the stone, "Wait, here, join." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices layered over each other. I could no longer tell if the sound was coming from the wind, from the ground, or from the graves themselves. Then I saw them, figures crouched beside the graves, pale and thin, with their heads down, hands moving as if writing in the dirt. They were humanoid, but wrong, limbs too long, skin gray and taut. Their faces were hidden, but I could feel their eyes on me. I froze, my backpack slipping from my shoulder. The map fluttered open to a new page, showing a single grave at the center of the section. The symbols surrounding it glowed faintly in the moonlight. "This is the one," the whisper said. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. The grave was unmarked, a mound of fresh earth in the center of the oldest section. Around it, the shadows moved subtly, forming a ring that seemed to hum with energy. The air grew colder, and I realized I couldn't breathe properly. I wanted to leave, but my feet moved forward on their own. I knelt beside the grave. The earth was loose, almost inviting my hands to touch it. And then I heard a faint voice from beneath the soil, "Thank you for coming." I stumbled back, heart hammering. The shadows closed in, surrounding me now, circling the grave in a silent, deliberate rhythm. The voice continued, soft, insistent, "You found me. Now it's your turn to help. Dig." I froze. My rational mind screamed at me to run, to leave the cemetery and never come back. But my hands moved before I could stop them. I grabbed a handful of dirt and tossed it aside. The whispers grew louder, encouraging, coaxing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. I was digging, throwing earth aside, sweat and dirt mixing on my hands and face. The shadows remained around me, silent watchers, guiding my movements. And then, finally, my hands struck something solid. I paused, heart pounding. Slowly, I brushed away the remaining soil. Beneath the mound was a coffin, old and blackened with age. It looked fragile, but it was sealed with something that resembled black wax. The whispers swelled, almost overwhelming my mind, "Open it. You know what to do." I hesitated. My body shook with fear, but something inside me, something deeper than logic, urged me on. I pried at the lid with my hands, then with a stick, until it began to crack. And then I heard it clearly, a voice, cold and ancient, coming from inside the coffin. "At last. I have been waiting." I stumbled back, almost tripping, as the coffin lid lifted slowly on its own. Inside was not a body, but a figure, pale and skeletal, eyes wide and hollow, lips moving but making no sound. And yet I heard it perfectly in my mind, "You found me. You followed the map. You are the next." The shadows shifted, moving closer, enveloping me. My legs buckled, and I realized with horror that the ground beneath me was no longer solid. The earth trembled and parted, pulling me toward the coffin. I tried to scream, to struggle, but my hands and feet felt heavy, sluggish, as though the ground itself had become a trap. The figure inside the coffin leaned forward. Its skeletal fingers reached for me. The whispers became deafening, a chorus of voices speaking directly into my skull. You belong here. You belong with us. Dig, help, join us. And then everything went black. When I woke, I was outside the cemetery gates, the map gone, my hands covered in scratches and dirt. My legs ached as though I had been kneeling for hours, but there was no trace of the shadows or the coffin. I tried telling my parents, my friends, even the local authorities, but no one believed me. They thought it was a hallucination, a dream, a story invented to scare myself. But it wasn't. The next night, I woke to scratching beneath my floorboards. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, follow the paths, find the next. And now, years later, I still have nightmares of Willow Creek Cemetery. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shadows moving, hear the whispers guiding me, see the coffin waiting beneath the earth. And I know, sooner or later, the map will return, and I will be forced to follow it again. Some things in this world do not rest. Some things do not forgive curiosity. Some things wait. And Willow Creek is one of them. I used to think graveyards were peaceful, even comforting. That was before I met the Lantern Man. My first encounter happened when I was 24, working as a delivery driver in a small town in New Hampshire. One night, I had to make a late delivery near the outskirts of town. The route took me past Willowbrook Cemetery, a place I had always avoided after hearing local stories about ghosts and disappearances. But that night, tired and distracted, I didn't think much of it until I saw the lantern. It was small, held by a figure standing among the gravestones. At first, I thought it was someone lost, maybe a visitor leaving flowers or mourning a loved one. But the figure didn't move the way a human does. Its head tilted unnaturally, just slightly, enough to make me feel watched. The lantern's light flickered in rhythm with the shadows, casting elongated shapes across the tombstones. I slowed my car, staring, and my blood ran cold when I realized the figure was staring back. Compelled, against all reason, I parked and stepped out. The air was thick with fog, carrying the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. My flashlight was in the car, but I didn't think to grab it. The lantern's glow cut through the mist like a small sun in a world of gray. As I approached, the figure lifted one arm, pointing toward the oldest part of the cemetery. Its voice was quiet but audible, carried on the wind. Follow me. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to turn and run, but curiosity, or foolishness, kept my feet moving. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, the fog seeming to cling to my legs, trying to pull me back. The Lantern Man moved slowly, gliding rather than walking, and I noticed that the graves we passed were arranged differently than I remembered. Tombstones I had seen as a child were gone, replaced by others I had never seen, their inscriptions worn or entirely blank. The deeper we went, the colder it became. My teeth chattered despite the summer air, and every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the creak of broken gates, even my own heartbeat. I tried to speak, asking who he was, why he was here, but no words came out. The Lantern Man didn't turn his head, but I could feel his gaze on me, a pressure that seemed to weigh on my chest and force me forward. Finally, we reached a clearing at the center of the cemetery. The lantern's light revealed a grave unlike any other, freshly dug, dark soil mounded perfectly, no flowers, no markers, just a faint odor of something ancient and decayed. The Lantern Man stopped. The fog swirled around us, thickening, and I realized I couldn't see the cemetery edges anymore. It was like we had been transported into a world of shadows. He raised the lantern higher, and suddenly the gravestones around us shifted. Shapes moved within them, not shadows, but forms, figures crouched and twisted, staring at me with hollow eyes. Their mouths opened and closed in silence, and I felt their gazes pierce me like knives. The Lantern Man's voice came again, calm and cold. They've been waiting for you. The lantern guides the lost, but sometimes it chooses. I took a step back, trembling. Choose me for what? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted the lantern so the light fell directly on the fresh grave. I noticed a small wooden box at the foot of the mound. Its surface was scratched and splintered, as if someone had tried to escape from inside. I swallowed hard. Open it, the lantern man whispered. I shook my head. I can't. But my hands moved anyway. Something inside me, a force I couldn't resist, drew me to the box. I lifted the lid slowly, and a cold wind rushed out, extinguishing the lantern. In the darkness, I felt the box shudder as if it were alive. I heard whispers, many voices layered together, crying out in fear, in pain, in anger. I stumbled backward, but the box tipped, spilling its contents across the soil. Inside were bones, small, fragile, but unmistakably human. And then a voice, soft and ancient, echoed from beneath the earth. Thank you, for freeing me. The lantern reignited, hovering above the ground as if held by an invisible hand. The figure of the lantern man was no longer standing on the path but floating above the clearing, taller, more imposing, his head tilted unnaturally. Around us, the grade shook violently, soil breaking apart, revealing more figures beneath. They weren't fully formed, more like shadows of people, hollowed out, reaching with hands that passed through the fog. You released them, the lantern man said, his voice now booming, resonating through the air and inside my skull. And now, you belong. Panic seized me. I turned to run, but the clearing had changed. The paths I had taken no longer existed. The headstones had shifted into a ring, enclosing me, and I could hear the whispers of hundreds of figures rising from the ground. Join us, join us. I stumbled and fell, trying to scramble out, but hands, cold, clammy, and unyielding, clutched at my legs. The lantern man descended slowly, his eyes hollow voids that swallowed the light. Fear is futile, he said. The lantern finds all who are lost, and once it does, there is no leaving. The voices grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of despair, sorrow, and rage. I felt my body being pulled down, the earth gripping me, the shadows of the dead crawling over me, wrapping around my limbs. I struggled, screaming, but my voice was drowned out by the thousand whispers repeating the same word over and over. Stay, stay, stay. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying outside the cemetery, the lantern gone, my clothes wet with dew. The sun was rising, soft light spilling over the graveyard. My hands were scratched, my shoes caked with mud, but there was no sign of the floating figure or the shaking graves. I ran home, heart racing, mind reeling. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Exhaustion, heat, imagination. But the next night, I saw the lantern again, glimmering through my bedroom window, hovering in the darkness, swinging slightly as if inviting me to follow. And now, every time I drive past Willowbrook Cemetery, I see it in the distance, a small flickering light, calling silently. I know one day, it will come closer. And I know that when it does, there will be no running. The lantern waits. Always waits. And when it calls your name, you will follow. I never planned to spend a night in the Hollowridge Cemetery. I was a journalism student at the time, obsessed with local legends and ghost stories. Hollowridge was infamous in our town in Connecticut. People whispered about a caretaker who had disappeared decades ago, leaving the cemetery abandoned, yet somehow maintained. I was curious, maybe too curious. I wanted proof. Something to make my blog post stand out. Something to scare people while convincing them it was true. I arrived around dusk, carrying my camera, flashlight, and notebook. The cemetery was enormous, stretching over acres of overgrown grass and crumbling headstones. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves. Birds cawed their last calls of the day, and the wind whispered through the old oaks. I was alone, or so I thought. I started walking along the central path, camera ready, documenting the oldest graves. Names faded, some illegible, some scratched into the stone with letters that seemed to twist when viewed from different angles. There were mausoleums that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. I took photos, noting the eerie silence. That's when I noticed something strange, a small, leather-bound diary lying atop a flat headstone. I picked it up. The cover was cracked and soft, as though it had been handled constantly. Flipping through, I realized it was the caretaker's diary. The entries were old, the ink faded, but legible. At first, it seemed normal, notes about trimming hedges, fixing fences, marking graves. But as I read deeper, the entries grew darker, almost frantic. The dead do not rest. They whisper. They watch. I cannot leave them, or they will claim me. I hear footsteps at night where no one walks. They want to be remembered. I cannot escape their eyes. A chill ran down my spine. I looked up from the diary and realized that the shadows between the graves were stretching unnaturally. I laughed nervously at myself, blaming the wind in my imagination, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. My flashlight flickered. I brushed the thought aside and continued reading. The diary mentioned a ritual the caretaker performed nightly to keep the dead contained. Every entry became more erratic, detailing strange patterns of graves, stones arranged in circles, candles left at specific points, and voices, always voices, that called to him. The final entry was dated the day he disappeared, decades ago. They are patient. They do not forgive curiosity. Tonight, I will join them, as all caretakers must eventually. I hope the next will be wiser, but they never are. I shivered. It felt like the diary itself was a warning. Yet I couldn't put it down. Night had fallen completely now, and the fog was thick, curling around the headstones like fingers. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering, almost beneath the wind, calling my name. Alex. My head snapped up. The cemetery was empty. No birds, no animals, no rustling leaves, just me and the shadows stretching longer in the moonlight. The whisper came again, clearer. Alex, come closer. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave immediately, but my curiosity, or maybe my foolishness, kept me moving forward. The diary had a page bookmarked with a symbol I didn't recognize. It was a circle, broken in 4 places, with small crosses at each corner. The accompanying note read, "The sender must be honored. Only then will they rest." I walked toward the center of the cemetery, the whispers following me, growing louder, layered like dozens of voices speaking at once. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness. I could hear the crunch of leaves behind me, faint footsteps, though no one was there. My breath came in ragged gasps. Suddenly, I tripped over something, a stone, freshly turned. My hands brushed the soil, and I realized it was a grave, freshly dug, unmarked, no flowers. A shiver ran through me. The whispers grew urgent, almost commanding. Do it, honor us, stay. I backed away, heart pounding, but the fog thickened, swirling around my legs, making escape difficult. The diary in my backpack felt impossibly heavy, as though it was pulling me toward the center grave. I knelt, lifting the diary and placing it on the earth beside the mound. The whispers became words now, urgent and insistent. Place it, follow the caretaker, join us. I wanted to resist, but my hands moved automatically. I began digging with my bare hands, soil breaking under my fingers as the whispers circled my mind, pressing me down. And then I saw them, shadows emerging from the surrounding graves, figures with hollow eyes, faceless, silent, moving closer. The fog thickened until I could barely see my own hands. The diary trembled, as though alive. The whispers became deafening. You are next, you belong here, stay. I stumbled backward, falling into the dirt. The shadows closed in, circling me. One of them leaned down, a figure in a caretaker's coat, face obscured by darkness, eyes glowing faintly. It pointed toward the diary. You see now, it said, voice like dry leaves rustling. Every caretaker ends here. They join us. Every curiosity has a cost. I screamed and tried to run, but my feet sank into the soil. The earth itself seemed alive, clutching my legs, pulling me toward the mound. My hands scraped against dirt and roots, but I couldn't escape. The shadows pressed closer, their hollow eyes boring into me, their presence suffocating. The diary's pages flipped wildly in the windless air, stopping on the final entry. I read aloud, terrified but compelled. The caretaker's soul binds the cemetery. Refuse, and they consume you. Accept, and you protect them until the next arrives. And then I understood. I wasn't being haunted. I was being recruited. The shadows surged, wrapping around me, chilling me to my core. I struggled, screamed, and then, darkness. When I woke, I was outside the cemetery gates. The diary was gone. The soil on my hands remained, and I could still feel the whispers in my mind. The fog had cleared. The moon was high in the sky. I ran home, never speaking of it. But at night, I still hear the whispers. When the wind is right, and the air is still, I swear I can hear the scratching of pages, the soft turning of the diary's leaves. And I know that one day, I will have to return. Hollow Ridge waits. The caretaker always waits. And curiosity is a trap you can never escape. I moved to a small town in Pennsylvania during my senior year of college. The town was charming on the surface, with cobblestone streets, antique shops, and a historic church at its center. But it was the cemetery behind the church that drew my attention, and eventually, my obsession. The locals called it Ravenwood Cemetery, though few spoke of it openly. Those who did always used a hushed tone, and when pressed for details, they would avert their eyes. I didn't understand why at the time, and, naturally, my curiosity grew stronger. I first noticed something strange one evening while walking home from class. The cemetery was quiet, shrouded in mist, headstones reaching up like crooked fingers. I thought I heard a faint ringing, like a bell tolling, but softer, more ethereal, as if it were underwater. I paused, straining to hear. The sound stopped when I stepped closer, leaving only the rustle of leaves. Dismissing it as my imagination, I continued walking. But that night, I dreamed of bells, hundreds of them, ringing in sequence, though no clock or church was nearby. And in the dream, the cemetery moved, reshaping itself around me. The next evening, I returned to Ravenwood. I wanted to see if I could catch the source of the sound. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows across the graveyard. My flashlight barely penetrated the thickening fog. As I walked among the tombstones, I noticed something peculiar. Several graves had small, iron bells placed on them. They were old, tarnished, and silent, but they looked recently polished. I bent closer to inspect one. The engraving read, "For those who listen." As I straightened, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, thin and tall, emerged from behind a mausoleum. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its presence was commanding, almost ritualistic. In its hand, it held a small bell, identical to the ones I had seen on the graves. It raised the bell, and the air vibrated with sound, not loud, but resonant, penetrating. The fog swirled around me, curling like smoke, and I felt a cold brush against my cheek. "Do you hear them?" the figure asked, voice low and melodic. "I hear what?" I stammered, backing away. "The bells," it said. "They do not toll for the dead, they toll for the living. And tonight, they toll for you." I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "I don't understand." The figure tilted its head. "You will. But only if you listen." Something compelled me to obey. My curiosity overpowered fear. I followed the figure deeper into the oldest section of Ravenwood, where the headstones leaned at impossible angles, and the air felt heavier. The bells on the graves began to vibrate softly, as if responding to some unseen conductor. Shadows moved between the stones, indistinct forms that I could feel more than see, their presence pressing against me from all sides. We reached a circular clearing in the center of the cemetery. The ground was bare, the soil dark and moist. In the center stood a bell tower, or at least a skeletal frame of one, broken and twisted. The figure raised its bell again, and the surrounding bells on the graves began to chime in a pattern I could almost recognize. It was music, eerie and discordant, but strangely captivating. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating in rhythm with my heartbeat. "Do you feel it?" the figure whispered. "The cemetery speaks. And it chooses who will hear." I nodded, my throat dry. My hands shook, and I realized I had been holding the edges of the graves, clinging for some sense of stability. The fog thickened, and I could barely see the figure anymore, but I could hear its voice guiding me. The bells, once silent, now rang in a pattern that seemed almost alive, arranging themselves in sequences that were impossible to ignore. I knelt in the center of the clearing. The ground felt unnatural, soft and spongy, almost breathing beneath my hands. I glanced at the figure, but it was gone. Only the ringing remained, surrounding me, encasing me in sound. I tried to stand, but my legs refused. The bell's vibrations pressed against my eardrums and chest, forcing me down, hypnotizing me. And then, a whisper, not from the figure, but from the soil, the graves, the air itself. "Listen, obey, join." My fingers trembled as I reached toward the nearest grave. The bell atop it quivered, then rang loudly, sending a shock through my body. The sound was more than auditory, it penetrated my mind, weaving into my thoughts, leaving no room for resistance. The ringing continued, faster, sharper. Shadows began to rise from the ground, elongated and twisted, their faces featureless but their presence undeniable. They circled me, whispering, chanting, swaying in rhythm with the bells. I could feel myself being drawn toward the center of the clearing, toward the skeletal bell tower. The air was thick with moisture and fear, and my lungs burned with each breath. The bells on the graves rang louder, synchronized with the movement of the shadows. I realized they weren't just bells, they were conduits, channels through which the cemetery communicated. And now, it wanted me. The figure appeared again, hovering near the bell tower, taller and more imposing than before. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale green light cutting through the fog. It extended its hand, beckoning. "You hear them," it said. "You are chosen. To resist is to vanish. To obey is to protect." I could feel the pull, the irresistible compulsion to join. My legs moved against my will, carrying me to the center, where the bell tower stood. Shadows surrounded me, stretching, bending, merging with the fog. The ringing became deafening. And then I saw them, hundreds of figures emerging from the graves, faceless, twisted, reaching with hands that seemed to pass through reality itself. They converged on the bell tower, forming a circle around me. The figure in front of me raised its bell one final time. The sound shattered the air, vibrating in my bones. I screamed, trying to resist, but my body no longer belonged to me. The cemetery had claimed it. The whispers became a chorus, chanting in unison. "Stay, protect, join, forever." I felt myself falling into the earth, sinking into the soil as the bells rang louder and louder. My vision blurred, the shadows merging with my body, the ringing becoming my heartbeat. And then, silence. When I awoke, I was outside the cemetery gates, alone. The fog had lifted. The bells were gone. My clothes were torn, my hands scratched from the soil, but there was no sign of the bell tower, the shadows, or the figure. I ran home, shaken, trying to rationalize everything as a hallucination. But at night, when the wind is still, I hear faint chimes, soft and distant, weaving through my dreams. And I know, deep down, that the cemetery waits. Always waits. The bells will toll again, and when they do, it will be my turn. Ravenwood is patient. It always chooses. And one day, it will choose you too. I never believed in ghosts until the summer I worked as a night groundskeeper at Ashmore Cemetery in Vermont. I was 21, broke, and desperate for a job that paid cash. The cemetery had been neglected for decades, overgrown with weeds, moss-covered headstones, and iron gates that screeched in the wind. The townspeople avoided it after sunset, warning that something wasn't right, but I laughed off their stories. Ghosts didn't exist. Or so I thought. My first night began innocuously enough. Armed with a flashlight, a pair of gloves, and an old rake, I patrolled the cemetery, trimming overgrown paths and removing fallen branches. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, clinging to the ground and curling around the tombstones like smoky fingers. It smelled of wet earth and decay. I shrugged, telling myself it was just the natural smell of an old cemetery. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I noticed something odd, a faint light flickering in the distance. At first, I assumed it was a passing car, but the cemetery was miles from any main road. As I approached, the light resolved into a lantern, suspended in the air above one of the older sections. No one was holding it. The light bobbed gently, as if guided by an unseen hand, and moved along the cracked and mossy paths. Curiosity won over caution. I followed it, my flashlight now useless against the fog's thickness. The lantern led me past graves I hadn't noticed during the day, some toppled, some half-buried, some with names long forgotten. The light stopped at a large mausoleum in the back corner of the cemetery. Its doors were ajar, hinges groaning as if they hadn't been opened in decades. A voice, low and rasping, drifted from within. "You came." I froze, my stomach twisting. Who's there?" I called, trying to sound brave. My voice sounded small and weak in the thick fog. The lantern floated inside the mausoleum, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, dressed in a black coat, face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Its hands were clasped behind its back, and it moved silently, gliding rather than walking. "I am the caretaker," the figure said, voice smooth yet cold. "And you are here now." Panic clawed at me, but I couldn't move. There was something hypnotic about the figure, something in the way the fog seemed to bend around him. I work here," I stammered. "You work," the figure said. "Yes. But working is not enough. The cemetery chooses who maintains it, who preserves it, and who listens." Before I could respond, I felt the earth tremble beneath my feet. The mausoleum doors slammed shut, though no wind blew. Shadows emerged from the graves around me, tall, twisted, faceless figures, moving in silence. My flashlight flickered and died. The lantern was the only source of light, casting long, unnatural shadows across the cracked stones. "Listen," the caretaker whispered. The shadows began to swirl, forming a circle around me. I could feel their gaze, piercing and demanding. The caretaker raised his hand, and the lantern floated higher. The fog thickened, filling my lungs with a cold, damp weight. I could hear whispers, hundreds of voices, layered together, calling my name, pressing into my mind, insisting. "Join, guard, obey." I tried to back away, but my feet sank into the soil, as if the cemetery itself were alive. I fell to my knees, struggling against the invisible force, but it was futile. The caretaker's voice cut through the whispers. "You are chosen. To resist is to vanish. To obey is to survive." I shook my head violently. "No. I don't want this." But my hands moved on their own. They dug into the dirt beside a broken grave, soil crumbling under my fingers. I could feel roots and stones scraping my palms, but the urge was irresistible. The shadows circled closer, stretching, merging with the fog. The lantern hovered over the grave, casting an eerie green glow on the freshly turned soil. I brushed away more dirt, revealing a coffin lid, blackened and splintered with age. The caretaker leaned closer, voice low, almost gentle. "Open it. Hear them. Become one with them." I hesitated. My heart pounded, my lungs burned. But fear gave way to something darker, a compulsion I couldn't resist. I pried the coffin lid open. Inside was not a corpse, but a figure, skeletal yet strangely humanoid, its hollow eyes fixed on me. And then the whispers became voices, distinct now, calling from inside the coffin. We waited, for you, the living must guard the dead. The shadows surged forward. My arms were lifted, my body guided toward the coffin. The caretaker remained at the edge, silent, watching, his presence chilling yet oddly reassuring. I understood, this was the way it had always been. Every night, every caretaker, every living hand chosen to maintain the balance between the living and the dead. The figure inside the coffin spoke again, its voice grinding against my mind. Guard us. Protect the silence. Or be consumed. I felt a cold pressure on my chest, a pull, as though the ground itself wanted me beneath it. My limbs moved mechanically, obeying some unseen command. The whispers filled my skull, 1,000 voices layering over each other, commanding, coaxing, promising. The lantern light swirled, blinding, illuminating the faces of the faceless shadows. I realized then that I wasn't just watching this happen, I was becoming part of it. My hands, my eyes, my voice were no longer mine. I was being absorbed, incorporated into the cemetery's eternal cycle. Hours, or maybe seconds, passed. I lost all sense of time. When I finally regained awareness, I was standing at the cemetery gates, the caretaker gone, the lantern extinguished, and the fog thinning. My hands were scratched, my clothes torn, and the earth under my fingernails dried and cracked. But the whispers lingered in my mind, soft and persistent. You will return, you cannot escape, the dead always wait. I ran home, shaking, trying to rationalize everything as a hallucination, exhaustion, or heat-induced delirium. But I knew the truth, the cemetery chooses its guardians. And I had been chosen. Now, months later, I hear footsteps behind me at night, soft yet deliberate, echoing in empty streets. I see shadows where none should exist, flickering at the edges of my vision. And when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, faint yet persistent, reminding me. Ashmore Cemetery waits. The dead do not rest. And one day, it will call for you too. I grew up near the old Pine Hollow Cemetery in upstate New York, a sprawling, forgotten place hidden behind dense pines. As a teenager, I was fascinated by the stories my friends whispered, stories about a man who wandered the graves at night, carrying a whistle that could call the dead from their slumber. Most dismissed it as a local legend, but my curiosity got the better of me. One late October night, I decided to see for myself. The cemetery was shrouded in fog when I arrived, the headstones looming like pale sentinels in the moonlight. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots, the only sound I made in the oppressive silence. I wandered down the main path, flashlight in hand, noting the oldest graves, some leaning, some toppled, many completely unmarked. That's when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistle, barely audible over the rustling trees. I froze, straining to hear. The sound seemed to float from the far end of the cemetery, where the oldest graves were. My heartbeat quickened, but instead of retreating, I moved toward it. Each step seemed heavier, the air thickening, carrying the smell of damp earth and something older, something decayed. The whistle continued, melodic yet eerie, and I realized it wasn't coming from any ordinary instrument, it was alive, resonating with a presence I couldn't explain. As I approached a circle of ancient headstones, I saw him. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a long, dark coat, standing perfectly still with a whistle at his lips. His face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I felt his gaze pierce me. The fog curled around him, and I could see shadows shifting unnaturally at the edges of my vision. "Do you hear them?" he asked, voice calm yet commanding. "I hear what?" I stammered, gripping my flashlight tighter. "The dead," he said. "They listen. They wait. And when the whistle calls, they come." I laughed nervously, thinking it a joke, but the air immediately thickened, oppressive and cold. The leaves stilled, the trees silent. Then, from the graves themselves, I saw movement, figures rising slowly, pale and thin, faces featureless, reaching toward the man. My blood ran cold. He lowered the whistle and gestured toward me. "You've come willingly," he said. "That is rare. Most fear what they cannot see. Most never return after hearing the call." I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. Some force, ancient and relentless, held me in place. The man began to whistle again, low at first, then rising in pitch. The shadows responded, swaying, crawling, moving faster toward the center circle. I could hear whispers forming words, pleading, warning, chanting, stay, obey, join. I fell to my knees, heart pounding, and realized I could feel the vibrations of the whistle in my bones, resonating through the soil, through the very air. I tried to cover my ears, but the sound wasn't just auditory, it invaded my mind, commanding, hypnotizing. You must help me, the man said. The dead cannot leave unless someone guides them. You have the choice, guide, or be claimed. I shook my head violently. I don't. But my hands moved on their own. I began to dig at a mound near the center of the circle, the soil soft and strangely warm under my fingers. Roots seemed to curl around my wrists, pulling me closer, guiding my movements. The shadows pressed in, faceless forms reaching, whispering, urging. The whistle's tone sharpened, piercing, demanding obedience. I uncovered a coffin, blackened and ancient. The man's eyes glowed faintly beneath his hat. The shadows circled faster, weaving around my body, their whispers a chorus in my head. Open, here, join, stay. I hesitated. My body trembled uncontrollably, but I felt the pull, the irresistible force drawing me to the coffin. With shaking hands, I lifted the lid. Inside was not a body, but a hollow figure, skeletal yet vaguely human, eyes wide and empty. Its mouth moved, though no sound escaped. And yet I heard it perfectly in my mind. Thank you, you hear us, you guide us now. The shadows surged, enveloping me, and the man stepped back, whistle lowered. The living hand binds the dead, he said. Every century, every caretaker. Every curiosity has a price. Now, you maintain the balance. The whispers grew louder, filling my skull, forcing me to kneel beside the coffin. I tried to resist, but it was impossible. My fingers brushed the hollow figure, and I felt its essence pass into me, a weight, a presence, ancient and relentless. The whistle sounded again, now inside my mind, vibrating, commanding, instructing. Hours passed, or maybe seconds, I could no longer tell. When I finally regained awareness, I was outside the cemetery gates, alone. The fog had lifted. My clothes were torn, my hands scraped, but the whistle was gone. And yet, in my mind, I could still hear it, faint and persistent, guiding me, reminding me of the debt I owed. Since that night, I've never returned to Pine Hollow Cemetery, yet I cannot escape it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint whistle carried on the wind. I wake with my hands trembling, as though still digging, still guiding the dead. And I know that one day, I will be compelled to return, drawn back into the circle, the shadows, the whistle. Pine Hollow waits. The dead listen. And the whistle will call for you too. I never thought I'd be responsible for a cemetery, let alone one with a reputation like Blackthorn Cemetery in rural Ohio. I was 23, desperate for work, and when the caretaker position opened, I jumped at the chance. The job description was simple on paper: maintain the grounds, keep the gates locked at night, and ensure the cemetery remained in order. What it didn't say was that Blackthorn didn't just require maintenance, it demanded vigilance. And by vigilance, I mean constant, suffocating awareness of forces I couldn't begin to understand. The first night, I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The cemetery was enormous, stretching across acres of rolling hills, overgrown paths, and crumbling headstones. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and something metallic, almost like blood. I unlocked the gates, flashlight in hand, and began my rounds. At first, everything seemed ordinary, until I noticed the first anomaly. Near the oldest section, a figure stood by a weathered oak, too still to be human. Its features were obscured by shadow, but I could feel its gaze pressing down on me. The figure held something, a lantern, its light flickering unnaturally. I froze, heart hammering, and instinctively whispered, "Hello?" the figure didn't respond. It simply raised the lantern higher, then began to move along the path, floating more than walking. Against my better judgment, I followed. Something compelled me, an unexplainable pull that felt older than the trees, older than the gravestones. Each step forward made the air heavier, almost viscous, pressing against my chest, slowing my breathing. The lantern led me to a section of graves I hadn't noticed before, though I had studied the cemetery's layout meticulously during the day. The stones were ancient, covered in moss, with inscriptions I couldn't read. At the center was a freshly dug mound of earth, perfectly formed, unmarked, exuding an aura of weight and inevitability. The lantern figure stopped and tilted its head toward the grave. A voice echoed, soft yet commanding. "You maintain the living space, but the dead demand guardians. Tonight, you understand your place." I swallowed hard. I don't understand, I said, voice shaking. "You will," it said. The lantern rose higher, illuminating shadows moving among the headstones. They weren't fully formed, more like hollow silhouettes with faintly glowing eyes, reaching, swaying, whispering. I realized then that Blackthorn Cemetery wasn't just a resting place, it was a threshold, a liminal space where the living and dead coexisted, bound by rules older than memory. The shadows circled me, and I felt them pressing against my mind, probing, whispering. "Guide, obey, stay." Panic gripped me. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The earth beneath my feet shifted, soft and warm, almost alive, drawing me forward. My hands moved of their own accord, brushing the soil around the freshly dug mound. And then I saw it, a coffin, blackened with age, its lid etched with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The lantern figure spoke again. "Open it. Hear them. Become the keeper, or be claimed." I hesitated, every rational instinct screaming at me to run. But some deeper part of me, ancient and primal, compelled my hands to obey. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside was not a body, but a figure, skeletal yet vaguely humanoid, hollow eyes fixed on me. Its mouth opened, and I heard it clearly in my mind. "You have been chosen. Guide us, guard us, join us." The shadows surged, enveloping me, their whispers merging into a deafening chorus. My limbs trembled, yet my body moved mechanically, kneeling beside the coffin. I realized, with growing horror, that this was the cemetery's way. It chose, it claimed, it bound. Hours, or maybe moments, passed. I could no longer distinguish reality from the cemetery's illusions. The lantern's light danced over the shadows, casting shapes that twisted and writhed. The coffin's figure reached out, skeletal fingers brushing my hands, transferring something, an essence, an awareness, a presence. I felt my consciousness stretch beyond my body, entwined with the cemetery, bound to it eternally. The lantern figure hovered behind me. "You see now. Every caretaker is the living bridge between worlds. Refuse, and the cemetery will consume you. Accept, and you serve, until another comes." I could feel it, an oppressive inevitability, pressing against my mind. My heartbeat synced with the whispers, with the subtle rhythm of the graves themselves. I was no longer merely human, I was part of Blackthorn Cemetery, a living sentinel among the dead. When I finally regained awareness, I was outside the cemetery gates. The lantern was gone, the fog dissipated, and the world seemed normal again. My hands were scraped, my clothes torn, but the dread lingered. I knew the truth, Blackthorn chooses its guardians carefully, and once chosen, you cannot escape. The shadows, the whispers, the lantern, they will always find you. Months have passed. I keep the gates locked, maintain the paths, trim the overgrowth, and document every change meticulously. Yet I hear the whispers at night, faint but persistent, carried on the wind, reminding me of the dead I owe. Sometimes I glimpse shadows flitting between headstones, always just beyond clear sight. Blackthorn waits. The dead never rest. And when it calls, it will not ask, it will take. I never believed graveyards held secrets, at least, not until the summer I took a seasonal job at Hollow Grove Cemetery in Massachusetts. I was 22, working nights to save money for college, and Hollow Grove was notorious among locals. They whispered about a figure who wandered the grounds after dark, watching over the graves, but no one ever saw him directly, and the few who claimed to, never returned unchanged. Naturally, this only fueled my curiosity. I wanted proof. I wanted a story. The cemetery sprawled across several acres, a mix of centuries-old headstones and newer monuments. At sunset, the place transformed. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, the fog rolled in thick, and the air became cold, heavy, carrying the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves. On my first night, I walked the paths with a flashlight, trimming weeds, checking fences, and noting broken headstones. That's when I noticed it, a movement at the edge of my vision, fleeting, a dark silhouette that vanished when I turned my head. I laughed nervously, blaming the exhaustion and my imagination. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Every time I glanced at the treeline, the figure seemed closer. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just someone else working the cemetery, another seasonal hire perhaps. Yet, as I continued my rounds, I realized something chilling. The figure didn't move like a person. Its steps were too quiet, almost gliding, and when I stopped, it stopped. By midnight, I found myself at the oldest section of the cemetery. The headstones leaned precariously, moss-covered and cracked, some inscribed with dates from the 1800s. The fog thickened around me, curling over the stones like smoky tendrils. That's when I saw him clearly, the graveyard watcher. He was tall, draped in a long, dark coat, with a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. In his hand, he carried a lantern that flickered but never went out, illuminating only the space immediately around him. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, voice low, melodic, but carrying authority that made my knees weak. I work here," I replied, trying to sound calm. "I'm the night caretaker." He tilted his head. "Ah, but the cemetery doesn't care about jobs. It cares about balance. And you are curious." A chill ran down my spine. "I don't understand." "You will," he said. The lantern floated higher, casting eerie light across the graves. Shadows shifted in response, stretching unnaturally, forming shapes that almost resembled faces, watching me. The watcher raised his hand, and the lantern bobbed forward, leading me deeper into the oldest section. My feet moved automatically, against my conscious will, following him into a circular clearing surrounded by the tallest, oldest gravestones. At the center of the clearing was a mound of fresh earth. No marker, no flowers, just soil piled neatly as if expecting me. My flashlight flickered and died. The watcher's lantern hovered above the grave, light dancing across the fog. Around the clearing, shadowy figures emerged, faint and translucent, faces hollowed, eyes empty, all moving in silence toward the center. "You see now," the watcher whispered. "They are restless. The dead demand attention. They wait. They choose." I wanted to run, my heart pounding, but my body refused. I felt roots and soil gripping my ankles, drawing me closer to the mound. The shadows pressed in around me, reaching, whispering, compelling me. I could hear their words forming in my mind, repeated over and over. "Guide, obey, join, stay." Trembling, I knelt beside the grave. The watcher raised his lantern higher, illuminating the mound fully. The shadows leaned closer, merging with the fog, their whispers growing louder, merging into a cacophony that filled my skull. And then I saw it, a coffin lid, partially exposed beneath the soil. "You must open it," the watcher said, calm and commanding. "You are the living bridge. To refuse is to be consumed." I shook my head violently. I can't." But my hands moved on their own, compelled by some unseen force. I pried the coffin lid open. Inside was not a corpse, but a skeletal figure, humanoid, hollow-eyed, its mouth moving though no sound escaped. And yet I heard it clearly in my mind. "You have been chosen. Guide us. Guard us. Join us." The shadows surged forward, enveloping me, their whispers merging into a single, deafening chorus. I fell to my knees, trembling, but my body moved automatically, brushing the skeletal figure's hands. I felt something pass from it into me, an essence, a presence, something ancient and unyielding. The watcher remained at the edge, silent, observing. "You see now," he said. "Every caretaker is bound. Every curiosity comes at a cost. Refuse, and the cemetery devours. Accept, and you maintain, until another comes." I realized, with horrifying clarity, that I was no longer merely human. My consciousness stretched beyond my body, entwined with the cemetery, bound to its eternal rhythm. I could feel the graves beneath me, the soil, the fog, the whispers, all part of a single consciousness that now included me. When I finally regained awareness, I was outside the cemetery gates. The watcher was gone, the lantern extinguished, the fog cleared. My clothes were torn, my hands scratched and dirty. I ran home, shaken, trying to rationalize everything as a hallucination caused by exhaustion, stress, or imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth: Hollow Grove chooses its guardians carefully, and once chosen, escape is impossible. Now, months later, I hear the whispers in the quiet of night, soft but persistent, reminding me of my debt. Shadows move at the corner of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And I know that one day, I will be compelled to return fully, drawn back into the circle, the shadows, the watcher, the whispers. Hollow Grove waits. The dead never rest. And one day, it will call for you too. I always thought that visiting cemeteries at night was just a thrill for adrenaline junkies, a morbid curiosity. That was until I worked the night shift at Gravesend Cemetery in Maine, a sprawling graveyard older than the town itself, with graves dating back to the 1700s. My job was simple, or so I thought: patrol the grounds, ensure no trespassers, and check that the gates were securely locked. But Gravesend had a way of revealing its secrets to those who lingered too long, and I was about to discover its darkest. It began the first night I arrived. The cemetery was shrouded in dense fog, every headstone emerging like the teeth of some ancient beast. The air was thick, cold, and metallic, carrying the unmistakable scent of wet earth and decay. As I walked the winding paths, flashlight in hand, I noticed something strange: a figure standing perfectly still beside a moss-covered obelisk. At first, I thought it was a statue, but the subtle rise and fall of its shoulders betrayed life. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. I approached cautiously, the fog curling around my boots like living tendrils. As I got closer, I noticed a small, tattered notebook in its hands, and the figure, now undeniably human, lifted its head, revealing hollow eyes that seemed impossibly deep, almost void-like. Its voice was low, rasping, yet carried an odd rhythm, almost musical. "You shouldn't have come alone. I work here," I stammered, trying to keep my composure. "I'm the night caretaker." The figure shook its head. "No. Not a caretaker. A visitor. And visitors are dangerous." I froze. Something in its tone, calm yet commanding, made my stomach twist. I wanted to retreat, to run, but my legs refused. The figure gestured toward the oldest section of the cemetery. I followed, unable to resist, drawn toward a cluster of tombstones dating back centuries. As we walked, the fog thickened, swallowing paths and stretching the shadows of the graves unnaturally. The notebook's pages fluttered in the air, though there was no wind, as if the figure's presence caused the air itself to move. "Do you see them?" it asked. "See what?" I whispered. "The watchers," it said. "Those who do not rest. They wait for the living to remember, to stumble, to falter. And tonight, you have stumbled." At that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Shadows emerged between the graves, faceless, elongated, gliding rather than walking, circling around me, pressing against the edges of my mind. Their presence wasn't just visual, I felt them crawling along my spine, their cold weight pressing into my chest. The figure raised the notebook. "Read," it commanded. "If you refuse, you are already lost." I hesitated. Every rational instinct screamed to run, to ignore the impossible, but my hands moved against my will. I took the notebook, opening it to the last page. The words were written in a delicate, looping hand, though the ink seemed impossibly dark, almost bleeding into the paper. Every visitor becomes a witness. Every witness becomes a guardian. The dead demand it. Obey, or join. The shadows swirled closer, whispering, their voices forming a chorus in my mind. Guide, obey, stay, join. The figure stepped back, allowing the shadows to encroach, circling the old graves like predators. My heartbeat synced with their rhythm, a pounding that echoed through my skull. I dropped to my knees, unable to resist the pull toward a fresh mound at the center of the clearing. My hands moved, digging through soil that was unnaturally soft and warm. I unearthed a coffin, blackened and scarred with age, etched with symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. "Open it," the figure whispered. "Hear them. Accept, or vanish." I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. But the shadows pressed in, their whispers growing louder, filling every corner of my mind, erasing reason. My hands moved on their own, prying the lid off. Inside was a skeletal figure, humanoid yet impossibly thin, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The moment I touched it, I felt a presence invade me, a consciousness, ancient and relentless, intertwining with my own. The shadows surged, enveloping me, pressing into every sense. The skeletal figure's mouth opened, and though no sound escaped its hollow lips, I heard it clearly in my mind. "You are chosen. You are the living bridge. Guide us, guard us, join us." My vision blurred. The notebook flew from the figure's hands into mine, its pages flipping violently, stopping on a final, unmarked page. Words etched themselves into my mind without effort. "Once you witness, you cannot leave. Once you accept, you cannot return. The dead remember, and the dead demand." I fell forward, kneeling beside the coffin, every rational thought erased. My limbs moved automatically, brushing the skeletal figure's hands, feeling its essence pass into me. I understood then, I was no longer merely human. I had become part of Gravesend, bound to the cemetery, its guardian and its prisoner. When I finally regained awareness, I was outside the gates. The figure, the shadows, the coffin, they were gone. My clothes were torn, my hands scratched, but the whispers remained, soft and insistent in my mind. I ran home, trying to rationalize it as a hallucination, exhaustion, or stress, but deep down, I knew the truth. Gravesend Cemetery does not allow witnesses to leave unchanged. Months have passed, yet I cannot sleep without hearing the whispers, the subtle movement of shadows at the edge of my vision. My reflection sometimes flickers, an almost skeletal figure staring back, hollow eyes watching me. I know I am no longer entirely myself. I am bound, tethered to the cemetery's will. In the notebook, it appears at my bedside on certain nights, its pages blank until I open them, revealing the words of the next chosen visitor, the next unlucky soul who will stumble, falter, and be claimed. Gravesend waits. The dead do not rest. And one night, when curiosity tempts you to, it will call for you. The gate will creak. Shadows will move. And the whispers will demand obedience. You cannot resist. You cannot run. Because once you witness, you belong forever.